Hey there, and welcome in. Tonight, we're following the faint trail of an ancient order, one whispered about more than it's understood, the Knights Templar. You've probably heard the stories: crusades, lost treasure, secret rituals. But beyond the myths and the firelight lies something deeper: a structure, a silence, and a question that refuses to die. Did they ever truly vanish? This isn't just a tale of knights and kings, it's about memory, suppression, and the quiet architecture of power. A story built into stone, scattered across cathedrals, maps, and perhaps our world today. Before we dive in, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if these kinds of slow, thoughtful journeys feel like home to you. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing that little constellation of quiet minds across the globe. So dim the lights, settle in, and listen closely. Sometimes, the echoes of history speak loudest when no one is listening. There are stories we inherit without realizing it, not in the words we read, but in the spaces between them. A glance carved into a cathedral arch, a symbol half erased from a crumbling tomb, a silence that seems to echo even in places long abandoned. The tale of the Knights Templar begins like that, not with fanfare or finality, but with a question that refuses to be buried. Officially, they vanished in the early 14th century, condemned by kings, disbanded by popes, their leaders burned, and their riches supposedly scattered or seized. And yet, across time, they linger, not as ghosts, but as something stranger: a rhythm, a pattern, a structure that should not still exist, and yet does. You see it not in what is preserved, but in what refuses to die. The Templars are not just a part of history. They are a question that history never managed to answer. How can something so powerful, so rooted in the visible world of politics and religion, vanish so thoroughly and yet still feel so close? They were warriors and monks, bankers and mystics, builders and protectors. Their contradictions were part of their strength. They answered to no king, served no single nation, and moved through borders as though they barely mattered. At their height, they controlled vast networks of fortresses, lands, and trade routes from England to Jerusalem. Their influence was financial, spiritual, military, and symbolic. And then, without warning, it was all stripped away. Or so we're told. But the records are patchy, the accusations vague, the trials laced with coerced confessions and political pressure. When something that vast disappears so suddenly, we should ask, was it really destroyed, or did it simply learn how to hide? That is the question at the center of this journey. Not whether the Templars still wear cloaks or ride in secret through mountain passes, but whether the idea of them, the discipline, the design, the silent code, was buried beneath the ash, or carried forward in ways that no sword could reach. You do not need to believe in conspiracy to feel that something remains. You only need to pay attention to the way symbols repeat in places they do not belong, to the way certain structures seem to follow a logic no modern architect remembers, to the quiet orders that appear across history, organized, devout, fiercely private, and disappear just as suddenly as they arrived. There is a method at work, a system designed not to endure in the light, but in the shadow. And tonight we walk the edge of that shadow, not to find a definitive answer, but to feel the presence of a question that still waits to be asked. What if the Templars never left? What if they simply stopped needing to be seen? It begins, as many things do, not with survival, but with disappearance. October 13th, 1307. Dawn breaks over France, and hundreds of knights are arrested simultaneously. It is swift, coordinated, and brutal. The charge, heresy. The truth, political betrayal. King Philip IV of France is deeply in debt to the order. His coffers are empty, his ambitions grand, and the Templars, despite their vows of poverty, possess vast wealth in land, silver, and influence. The Pope, pressured and cornered, becomes an accomplice. Within days, the strongest and most mysterious military monastic order in Christendom is dismantled, on paper, but paper burns easily. And what followed was not so much an end as it was a redirection. The knights imprisoned were only those within reach. The ones stationed abroad, in Scotland, Portugal, Cyprus, vanished into silence. Their names disappeared from records. Their commanderies were either taken over by other orders or left to rot. But the trail does not end there. In fact, it becomes sharper once it grows faint. When an institution collapses, its memory lingers in absence, in questions no one thought to ask when it stood in the open. For centuries, historians have debated the fate of those who escaped the Purge. Ships left the port of La Rochelle just before the arrests. No one knows where they went. Some say England, others whisper of Portugal. A few imagine far-off lands beyond the reach of the papacy. But the most curious detail is that no fleet was reported sunk, no cargo was found. If the treasure of the Templars was taken, it was not by thieves, it was by the order itself, anticipating the betrayal that many believed they saw coming. These were not foolish men. They had eyes in every court, informants in every guild, and perhaps most importantly, they understood that true continuity depends not on gold, but on design. What they protected, whether it was wealth, knowledge, or doctrine, was never meant to sit in vaults or reliquaries. It was meant to move, to adapt, to vanish when necessary. The arrests were not a surprise. They were a signal. In the aftermath, rumors multiplied. Some claimed the Templars sought refuge under new banners, disguised as stonemasons, merchants, even monks of other names. Others believed they had formed a silent council, pulling the strings of Europe from behind closed doors, but most simply assumed they had dissolved, disbanded, disgraced, gone. And maybe that is exactly what the order wanted. A vanishing so complete it would seem permanent. But there are traces. A chapel in Portugal built with geometry no other order used. A carved cross found in an underground chamber far from any known commandery. A strange recurrence of symbols and documents tied to maritime trade guilds long after the Templars supposedly ceased to exist. These are not proof, but they are not coincidence either. They are the shape of something that has no name anymore, but still moves, still chooses, still builds in silence. The Templars may have lost their title, but they did not lose their method. And that method, quiet, disciplined, precise, might be the very reason they never truly died. To understand how something can vanish and still persist, you have to look at what the Templars truly were. Not just knights or monks, but an institution unlike any other of its time. They operated across borders above kings and outside the reach of most earthly laws. They were trusted with treasure, with secrets, with the logistics of empire. Their commanderies were not just monasteries or fortresses, they were nodes in a network. And that network was built to survive siege, betrayal, even collapse. When you study the architecture they left behind, you begin to see it. The round churches built in mimicry of the Holy Sepulchre, the defensive layouts designed for rapid withdrawal, the way their properties linked ports, trade routes, and diplomatic centers across Europe and the Holy Land. This wasn't random. It was engineered. Every location, every ritual, every insignia had a function. The order at its core was not just an armed brotherhood. It was a system. one that could be disassembled, yes, but not easily destroyed. When the arrests came, many Templars submitted, but others vanished. They didn't resist openly. That wasn't their way. They left, quietly, methodically. Some integrated into other orders, the Knights Hospitaller, the Teutonic Knights, the emerging guilds of Europe. Others retreated to sympathetic territories. In Portugal, King Denis refused to comply with the papal orders. Instead of executing or exiling the knights, he rebranded them as the Order of Christ. Same men, same vows, new banner. In Scotland, where the Pope's influence was weaker, some say they fought alongside Robert the Bruce, their training and tactics blending seamlessly into the rebellious campaigns. In Switzerland, not long after the suppression, a military force with uncanny organization and discipline began to shape the foundation of what would become one of Europe's most famously neutral and fortified states. Coincidence? Possibly. But if you know the Templar method, it doesn't feel accidental. It feels like adaptation. What makes the Templar story so enduring is not just the drama of betrayal or the mystery of their treasures, it's the way they disappeared. Not in defeat, but in design. The plan was never to live forever as a formal order. It was to endure in function. The rituals they practiced, the codes they developed, the alliances they nurtured, all of it was portable, transferable, capable of outliving titles and uniforms. You do not need to keep the name if the blueprint remains. And the blueprint was never about fame. It was about resilience. That's why when you look at the post-Templar world, you don't see a void. You see echoes. Systems that emerged where they should not have. Symbols that repeat in places no one can explain. Values, discipline, secrecy, fidelity to principle that quietly resurfaced in movements centuries later. That is not coincidence. That is continuity by another name. And the more closely you study the structure they built, the more you realize it was never meant to die with them. It was meant to be passed on, to those who knew how to carry it in silence. What if survival wasn't the goal, but the test? The Templars did not build with permanence in mind. They built with pressure in mind. Pressure from kings, from popes, from enemies both seen and hidden. They understood that visibility was a weakness. What begins in glory often ends in fire, and the order's founders were no strangers to martyrdom. They knew how power turned, so they built a model that could dissolve and still function. That is perhaps the greatest secret of the Templar legacy. It was designed to survive not as an institution, but as a pattern of behavior. Something that could pass through different hands, wear different clothes, and speak in different tongues, yet still remain true to its root. You can burn a name, confiscate a treasury, dismantle a hierarchy. But if what you built has already learned how to live without those things, then what you've destroyed is only the surface. Consider the concept of the cell. Long before it became associated with underground resistance or intelligence agencies, the Templars were using decentralized, semi-autonomous commanderies. Each one functioned like a miniature replica of the whole. They followed the same rule. They trained to the same rhythm. They knew how to operate independently but stay connected. That was no accident. It was preparation. So when the top of the hierarchy fell, the base did not collapse. It scattered. It absorbed. It adapted. And in some places, it reemerged under other names, unchanged in essence, just disguised in form. The Portuguese Order of Christ, the Calatrava in Spain, certain guilds of builders and bankers in France and Italy, not copies, continuations. Even more telling is how their methods influenced the very idea of trust. The Templars were among the first to use written letters of credit across vast distances, an early form of banking that allowed pilgrims to travel without carrying coin. They pioneered security protocols for transporting wealth and data long before such concepts had names. When the order was dismantled, those innovations didn't vanish. They dispersed into cities like Venice, Bruges, and Lisbon, into the hands of merchant families, knightly orders, and secretive societies. That dispersion wasn't just survival, it was multiplication, a wildfire that carried not flame, but structure. And structure, once internalized, no longer needs a visible source. It propagates by logic, by utility, by the quiet recognition that what was built still works, even if no one remembers who first drew the plan. So when you hear the phrase, "the Templars survived," don't imagine cloaked figures in ancient halls clutching swords in the dark. Imagine systems, protocols, values that learned to live without a name. Imagine a way of thinking that passed into the bones of Europe, unnoticed but necessary. That is how they survived, not by clinging to the past, but by embedding themselves in the future. One commandery at a time, one silence at a time, until they no longer needed to be found, because their legacy had already arrived, ahead of them, waiting in the shape of things. Sometimes the clearest signs are found not in what was hidden, but in what was left behind in plain view. The Templars may have vanished from royal charters and papal records, but they did not erase themselves entirely. They couldn't. Their legacy was too deeply etched into the infrastructure of the world they helped shape. Travel through Europe today, and you will still find their fingerprints. In architecture that defies the style of its century, in rural roads that once connected outposts of an invisible network, in stonework marked with crosses that match no known liturgical order. Some of these are dismissed as coincidence. Others are attributed to later groups that may have borrowed from Templar models. But there is a consistency to the design, a quiet repetition of logic and geometry that suggests intention, something preserved not as a monument, but as a method. Their round churches, for instance, were more than stylistic homage to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They were spatial codes. Circular interiors allowed for equal surveillance, acoustic clarity, and subtle symbolism that blended liturgical space with military precision. In these spaces, prayer was not just devotion, it was rehearsal. Every part of a Templar chapel trained the body as well as the soul. They stood facing one another. They moved in disciplined formation. They learned to worship without needing an altar, a priest, or even a visible god. Their divinity was structural, lived through pattern and restraint. When these places fell into disuse, the buildings remained, but the rhythm inside them, the habits they trained, those passed into other hands. The church became a school. The fortress became a hospital. The ritual became something else entirely. But the structure stayed. That kind of endurance doesn't happen by accident. It suggests a plan, not for conquest, but for preservation. The Templars, for all their strength, were never reckless. They prepared for betrayal. They rehearsed collapse. And they knew how to turn loss into camouflage. You don't hide by disappearing. You hide by becoming useful in another form. And so the question isn't whether they left traces. The question is whether we're willing to see them for what they are. Not leftovers, but clues. Not ruins, but roadmaps. Because if the design still works, if the pattern still functions, then perhaps the builders never really left. You cannot tell the story of the Templars without tracing the geometry of silence they left behind. Their buildings are often the first clues, their round churches, fortified halls, and commanderies built with a peculiar symmetry. But these were not just aesthetic choices, they were architectural messages. Encoded into the layout of these structures is a philosophy: balance, containment, order under pressure. They were designed for devotion and defense in equal measure. But more than that, they were designed to be read by those who knew how. The angles, the light, the acoustics, they were not arbitrary. They were instructions, lessons in discipline, concealment, and alignment. In a world where parchment could burn and language could be distorted, the Templars built with stone because stone endures, even when its builders do not. There are chapels in England, tucked into wooded hills, that contain carvings no one can quite explain. Portuguese towers that resist the decay of time with engineering knowledge far beyond what was common in their day. Inscriptions in Latin and Old French with peculiar omissions, letters left out deliberately as if to direct attention to what isn't there. These are not superstitions or remnants of lost lore. They are the traces of a system that was meant to be used, not admired. And long after the knights themselves were gone, that system continued. It seeped into the practices of the stonecutters and the cathedral builders, into the trade routes that seemed immune to papal control, into the secretive scholarly circles that protected unorthodox knowledge under the guise of tradition. The Templar system did not disappear, it migrated. Even the concept of sanctuary changed because of them. Before the Templars, a church was a place to pray. After them, it was also a vault, a fortress, a node in a communication web that stretched from Paris to Acre. They redefined the role of sacred space, merging the spiritual with the tactical. And when their order was broken, those spaces adapted, but their function remained. Pilgrims became refugees. Clergy became messengers. Rooms once used for strategy were used for study, but the bones of the building still held the shape of what came before. And the new occupants, knowingly or not, continued the rituals, in posture, in silence, in the way certain rules were followed without knowing who wrote them. This is not speculation, it's pattern recognition. And patterns this consistent do not happen without guidance. Someone, somewhere, carried the blueprint. Maybe not all of it, maybe not even with full understanding, but enough to maintain the rhythm, enough to keep the silence intact. And that silence is what whispers most clearly now, centuries later. Not in words, but in form. Not in history books, but in alignment. It tells us that the Templars built for collapse. They knew their visibility would end. What they trusted was their method, their structure, their system. And they were right to trust it. Because centuries after their fall, it still holds. By the time most of Europe believed the Templars were gone, their influence had already sunk deep into the foundations of the world that replaced them. That is the paradox at the heart of their disappearance. An order destroyed publicly, ritually, with fire and condemnation, yet whose blueprint lived on so seamlessly it no longer needed a name. For most people, the legacy of the Templars becomes little more than a curiosity. Relics in museums, crosses carved into weathered door frames, vague references in dusty archives. But for those who study the way systems persist, through architecture, financial networks, even cultural habits, the pattern is unmistakable. They didn't just survive. They dissolved into the bloodstream of history. The Portuguese Order of Christ is perhaps the most obvious example. Formed under King Denis shortly after the suppression of the Templars, it absorbed their members, properties, and traditions almost entirely. The same knights who once guarded pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem now sailed with Henry the Navigator into uncharted waters. And with them went the same symbols, the same hierarchical structure, the same code of silence. The cross of the Order of Christ, so similar to the Templar cross, sailed on the caravels that mapped the Atlantic, stood over fortresses in Africa, and passed quietly into the aesthetics of empire. Yet few paused to ask how a suppressed brotherhood of monks reemerged with such reach and precision, because they were no longer calling themselves Templars. They didn't need to. The structure held. The design worked. Elsewhere in Europe, the signs are subtler. In Scotland, where papal authority held little sway after the Wars of Independence, there are persistent rumors, dismissed by mainstream historians, yet difficult to disprove, that Templar refugees fought alongside Robert the Bruce. The seal of the Templar Grand Master was allegedly used to authorize land grants and safe passages long after the order was officially dissolved. In Switzerland, just years after the Templar suppression, a strange alignment of cantons emerged. Fortified, fiercely independent, economically agile. A military neutrality developed there that bore uncanny resemblance to the disciplined secrecy of the old order. Again, no direct proof, only pattern, only the ghost of a method showing up where it is least expected. And that's the point. The Templars were not concerned with being seen. They were concerned with being effective. If their name had to vanish for their work to continue, so be it. Their legacy is not in banners, it's in structure. In the way influence moves silently, like water finding the lowest point, like roots threading through stone. It teaches us something profound about power, that the most enduring form is not dominance, but alignment. Not proclamation, but purpose. So when we look for them now, we must look not for knights, but for systems that should not exist, systems that hold inexplicably against time. Every age leaves behind a shadow, something half seen, half felt, that lingers even when names and dates fade. For the Templars, that shadow is unusually sharp. It shows up where it shouldn't, in legal documents from regions untouched by their original reach, in guild seals that mirror their sigils, in rituals practiced behind locked doors by societies that claim no connection to the order, yet move with uncanny familiarity through patterns the Templars once wrote. At some point, the line between inheritance and imitation blurs, and that's where the real story lives, not in hard proof, but in the persistence of design. Because when you begin to study systems of secrecy, of structured discipline and encoded values, you start finding the same fingerprints across different centuries. You start realizing that the Templars may have disappeared from history, but not from function. This is especially true in the rise of certain esoteric societies in the 17th and 18th centuries. Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, various knightly orders that claimed ancient origins, most scholars will say these were invented traditions, romantic reconstructions of lost ideals, and perhaps they were. But what if those reconstructions were not arbitrary? What if the blueprints were never entirely lost to begin with? What if someone had kept the rhythm alive, even in fragments, so that when the age was ready to rediscover the old structure, they didn't need to invent anything new. They only had to remember. Freemasonry in particular bears eerie similarities to the Templar model, a graded hierarchy of initiation. Rituals emphasizing silence, discipline, and moral integrity. Architectural symbolism. The blending of spiritual language with practical action. Many lodges even claimed at various points that the Templars were their ancestors, not metaphorically, but literally. Of course, most historians dismiss these claims as myth, but myths are not always false. Sometimes they are the scaffolding for truths too complex or too dangerous to state plainly. What matters isn't whether every detail of that lineage is accurate. What matters is that the model fit, that the system worked, that those who walked in silence, who moved in structure, who built without names, recognized something familiar in the Templar echo and made space for it to return. That's how the Templars may have persisted, not as a single, unbroken organization hiding in vaults and caves, but as a recurring structure that reappears wherever it is needed, like a tune remembered after silence, like a map drawn from memory. Their method was too useful to be forgotten, too resilient to be erased, and so it found its way back, in disguise perhaps, but unchanged in essence. The Templars understood something about time, that ideas last longer than names, that if your system serves something greater than power, it will find a way to survive its own extinction. The question that haunts this story isn't whether the Templars survived, it's whether we ever truly lost them. Disappearance is not the same as death. Erasure from official record is not the end of influence. If anything, it's often the beginning of a second, quieter life, one that flows beneath the surface of culture, politics, and belief. And that's where the real Templar legacy lives, not in lost treasure or secret bunkers, but in ideas passed forward through silence, through form, through systems that outlast those who designed them. The order may have fallen, but the conditions that created it never did. The need for structure in chaos, for discipline in belief, for loyalty in a world governed by betrayal. Wherever those needs exist, something like the Templar method finds a way back. There are examples buried in plain sight. In the diplomatic immunity once extended to papal envoys, in the coded handshakes and initiation rites of fraternal orders, in the principles behind non-governmental influence structures, foundations, banking consortiums, private intelligence networks that echo the way the Templars operated centuries earlier. Not beholden to a single throne or law, but guided by internal discipline and transnational reach. These are not direct descendants, but they carry the DNA, the memory, the method. That is what makes this question so difficult to answer with certainty. The Templars were not just men, they were a framework. Once a framework works, people do not let it go. They adapt it, quietly, permanently. Even within the Vatican, there are signs. The modern papal state operates through a blend of symbolic authority and tightly managed bureaucracy. The layering of secrecy and ceremonial presence, the balance between visible sanctity and hidden negotiation, all of it carries the faint echo of Templar discipline. There were those in the early church who viewed the Templars with suspicion, not because they were heretics, but because they were independent, because they answered to something higher than politics. And that independence, once it is tasted, has a tendency to endure. It attracts others who live on the margins of power, who serve not for glory, but for alignment. These are the kinds of people who carry systems forward, not out of ambition, but out of conviction. So perhaps the real survival of the Templars is not a matter of cloaked figures meeting in candlelit crypts. Perhaps it is a matter of continuity without form, a persistence that flows like an underground stream, unseen, but shaping the soil above it. The world today is full of systems that behave like the Templars once did, decentralized, resilient, quietly bound by rules no outsider can see. Whether or not the original order still exists, the world it helped design does. And in that world, its values are still alive. Sometimes what survives is not the body, but the rhythm, the repetition of certain movements, patterns, and instincts that outlast memory itself. With the Templars, the deeper you look, the more you realize they were not simply building an army or a network. They were cultivating a worldview, a posture toward existence, one defined by restraint, loyalty, self-denial, and precision. They took vows of poverty not because they hated wealth, but because they knew how seductive it was. They prayed not just for salvation, but to keep their minds disciplined. They trained not just to fight, but to remain calm under pressure. These weren't just religious men with swords. They were spiritual engineers. And what they engineered wasn't just a fighting force. It was a way of moving through the world that resisted decay. That kind of rhythm does not vanish. It lingers wherever discipline is needed and where silence becomes a shield. The modern world is awash in noise, yet beneath that chaos are quiet structures, organizations that don't advertise themselves, movements without figureheads, missions without fanfare. We call them think tanks, black ops programs, special orders, silent trusts. Their mechanisms vary, but their operating logic often feels ancient. Selective admission, rigid internal codes, protection of knowledge, absence of ego. Wherever you find systems like that, systems that prioritize function over fame, you are seeing the same rhythm the Templars lived by. It isn't just about secrecy, it's about a shared recognition that some missions are too important to be performed in public. That rhythm also echoes in the margins of academia, where certain historical threads are maintained quietly, without institutional approval. In private libraries, in untranslated manuscripts passed between researchers, in patterns of thought that persist even when the data is buried or inconvenient. The Templars understood that truth often requires stewardship, not proclamation, that what is sacred isn't what dazzles but what endures, and so they built a model for keeping sacred things alive: knowledge, values, discipline, even when those things were under threat. That model may no longer wear a cross or speak Latin, but it still functions. You see it wherever people carry something forward without being told to, wherever they act with integrity when no one is watching. It's not romanticism to say the Templars survived, it's recognition. They did what the most effective orders do. They disappeared strategically, not to escape destruction, but to become something else: a silent discipline, a hidden chord, a reminder that some structures are not meant to be seen, only felt. They no longer need cathedrals or swords. Their survival was never about visibility. It was about fidelity. And fidelity, once truly rooted, becomes generational. It travels not in bloodlines, but in choices. It is tempting to imagine the Templars as a mystery left behind, an unsolved case, a chapter closed by force and fire. But what if they are not behind us? What if they are ahead? Not as a brotherhood marching beneath red crosses, but as an idea whose time never truly ended. Their absence from the modern world may not be a disappearance, but a transformation. In fact, much of what they were, their silence, their discipline, their organizational genius, makes more sense now than it did then. In a world driven by distraction, a method built on focus becomes rare. In a world of spectacle, a structure that rejects attention becomes powerful. The Templars were built for a world like this one. And perhaps they never left because this world still needs what they knew. There is something peculiar that happens when systems of discipline vanish from public life. They reappear somewhere else, quietly, repurposed, but intact. You can see it in how elite military units operate, with silent codes and symbols passed in ritual, in how certain philanthropic foundations choose to act without ever making headlines, in how some global financial movements seem to follow logic written not in market data, but in tradition. All of this points to something more than coincidence. It points to a quiet persistence of values, the kind the Templars perfected: efficiency without vanity, strength without cruelty, knowledge without applause. These are not just behaviors, they are heirlooms, passed forward in the only way that truly matters: through practice. Even in language, there are echoes. Phrases like the inner circle, sacred duty, or orders of influence didn't appear from nowhere. They are cultural fossils, linguistic residues of systems that once required secrecy to survive. The Templars may not be the only origin of these phrases, but they lived them in a way few others did. Their world was one of thresholds between sacred and profane, known and hidden, loyalty and betrayal. And those thresholds still exist. They've just changed shape. The new battlegrounds are digital, psychological, institutional, but the need for inner discipline and silent alignment hasn't gone away. If anything, it's more necessary now than ever. So perhaps the right question isn't where did they go, but where do they still live? In which corners of the world are people still carrying the invisible rulebook? Who still understands that power is not what you hold, but what you refuse to use for selfish gain? That knowledge is not illumination, it is responsibility. Those who live this way, knowingly or not, are walking the same path the Templars did, maybe without the cloak, maybe without the name, but not without the rhythm. And in a way, that is the most faithful continuation of all. The deeper you go into the story of the Templars, the more it stops feeling like a medieval tale and starts to resemble something architectural, a structure built to outlast collapse. What they created wasn't just a religious military order, it was a framework for continuity. And like all true frameworks, it didn't need to be seen to function. It could be absorbed into other bodies, disguised in new roles, its presence reduced to pattern rather than name. This was the genius of their survival. The visible part, the knights, the banners, the rituals, was always the most disposable. What mattered was what lay beneath, the order of things. A way of moving through the world that prioritized discipline over display, method over emotion, and silence over fame. That structure didn't vanish when the order fell. It scattered like seeds. You see this most clearly in how institutions that came later often mirrored the bones of the Templar model. Not directly, perhaps, but unmistakably. Intelligence agencies, for example, often operate in cells, with limited communication across units, rigid internal hierarchies, and absolute loyalty to a higher purpose. That structure feels eerily familiar if you understand how Templar commanderies worked. Or take the world of finance. The Templars pioneered a rudimentary but surprisingly advanced international banking system, allowing travelers and nobles to deposit wealth in one region and retrieve it in another. Their early innovations in risk management, ledger keeping, and transfer security were far ahead of their time. When the order dissolved, those practices didn't die. They moved to merchant families, to royal treasuries, and eventually into the foundations of modern banking. The method endured even when its creators were burned at the stake. There's another piece rarely spoken of, the culture of training. The Templars recruited young. Boys were raised not just in the faith, but in the discipline of the order. They were taught to obey, to endure, to calculate. They were not bred for conquest, but for service. The same models later appeared in other elite institutions, military academies, clerical schools, secret societies. The core idea is always the same. Mold the mind before the world gets to it. Teach silence. Teach control. Teach how to act without needing recognition. The Templars understood that power is not bestowed, it is trained. And those who are trained that way do not simply forget when the title dissolves. They carry the rhythm forward. So when we ask if the Templars are still here, we are not asking if there are knights in white cloaks walking among us. We are asking if their system, refined through crisis, carried in silence, still breathes through other forms. And the answer, quietly, is yes. It breathes in the unseen architecture of the world, in the way influence moves without announcement, in the way loyalty sometimes means vanishing instead of fighting. The Templars are not a story about survival. They are a story about design. The downfall of the Templars was engineered to be total. Public confessions under torture. Executions in front of crowds. The image of Jacques de Molay, last Grand Master of the Order, burning at the stake was meant to be a final punctuation, a message that no one stood above kings or beyond the reach of the church. But what history often misses is that this kind of destruction is performative. It aims not just to punish, but to erase. And yet, erasure never truly works when the structure underneath remains intact. You can kill a man, but not an idea. You can burn a record, but not a method passed from person to person in quiet rooms. What the authorities destroyed was the visible layer. What remained was what had always mattered more: the invisible network, the muscle memory of obedience, the architectural logic of secrecy. Take, for instance, the idea of the oath. Templars swore themselves not to a man, but to a principle. That principle of selfless service, of sacred duty, of living under a higher rule than worldly law, cannot be extinguished by decree. It reappears in later centuries wherever people dedicate themselves to causes greater than their own survival. Revolutionaries, underground resistance cells, even humanitarian aid workers in conflict zones often echo the same language of duty, sacrifice, and silence. They may not name the Templars, but they follow a similar path. This isn't coincidence. It's cultural inheritance, something deeper than conscious imitation. The Templars left behind more than ruins. They left a mode of being. Even the concept of the martyr changes when seen through this lens. Jacques de Molay's execution did not destroy the order, it immortalized it. His final words, a curse upon his accusers, sparked centuries of legends. But more importantly, his silence under torture became a model for how belief can be stronger than fear. That model lives on in how later secret orders trained their members through trials of patience, moral tests, and above all, the demand for silence. A silence not born of cowardice, but of conviction. The kind that does not flinch even when the fire is lit. And that is perhaps the most subversive thing the Templars ever did. They turned defeat into transmission. Their downfall seeded the world with fragments, rituals, structures, habits that would outlive even memory. Not because they were preserved with reverence, but because they were too useful to discard. Useful for building something strong, something quiet, something enduring. In this way, the Templars did not just escape destruction, they made it part of their legacy. They used collapse as camouflage. They used death as continuity. And the world that followed did not bury them. It unknowingly became them. In the years following the Templars' dissolution, something strange began to happen across Europe. Not chaos, not collapse, but a quiet reshuffling. Their properties were seized, their members absorbed or exiled, and yet no great void opened in their absence. Ports continued to function. Pilgrimage routes remained secure. Financial transfers resumed under new custodians. The scaffolding of the world the Templars helped build held steady, as though prepared for this exact contingency. And perhaps it was. You don't run an operation that spans continents without planning for betrayal. You don't place your trust in names and seals. You trust the framework, the rhythm, the hands that can rebuild even after the center has been burned away. And rebuild they did, but not always where we were looking. Some former Templar lands were handed to the Hospitallers or absorbed into royal estates. Others quietly passed into private hands, particularly those of sympathetic nobility or merchant families with long-standing ties to the order. In these places, records grow thin, and what remains is often anecdotal, a sudden appearance of wealth where none was expected, an unusually fortified manor in an otherwise peaceful region, a family crest altered to resemble the Templar cross. Historians tend to treat these things as curiosities, but in the context of survival, they are signals, echoes, not proof, but continuation. In parts of Spain and Portugal, entire branches of the old order were simply renamed, the Knights of Montesa, the Order of Christ. The structure remained intact, only the banner changed. And in those altered forms, the Templars re-entered political life, no longer as a threat to kings, but as servants of new dynasties, explorers of new worlds. In fact, many of the navigators and cartographers of the early age of discovery were former Templars or trained by their successors. They did not just carry forward techniques, they carried forward a mindset, strategic secrecy, unwavering discipline, and a vision that reached beyond borders. The world's maps expanded because the Order's influence expanded with them. But not every survival was grand. In small villages near former commanderies, local oral traditions speak of men who continued to gather in secret, not to plot revolution, but to remember. They passed down prayers no longer found in church liturgy. They maintained rites at odd times of year. They buried their dead with strange markings carved into the stone. To outsiders, these were quaint regional quirks, but seen in the right light, they are fragments of a design still functioning, a code kept alive not in halls of power, but in shadows, not for dominance, but for preservation. That's how true systems endure, not by resisting change, but by absorbing it, by changing names, by changing faces, by never needing credit. And that is why the Templars, though erased from titles and law, are never truly gone, because what they built does not live in records. It lives in replication. There is a moment in every legend where the silence grows louder than the story itself. With the Templars, that moment came not during their rise or fall, but in the centuries that followed, when nothing was said, yet everything moved. Documents vanished, names reappeared in altered forms. Architectural features showed up in places the Order had never officially reached. And within this silence, a strange rhythm began to emerge. Not the booming cadence of knights on horseback, but the subtle thrum of continuity. In monasteries, trade routes, secret guilds, and private libraries, pieces of the Templar pattern kept showing up, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes half-remembered, but always in alignment with the old rule: endure without being seen. One of the most compelling signs of this rhythm lies in how others responded. The enemies of the Templars, the monarchs, bishops, and inquisitors who once plotted their downfall, kept watching. Even after the last official executions, royal and papal records continued to note strange activities in Templar ruins, unexplained gatherings, names that resurfaced in places of influence long after they were presumed dead. They feared not the ghost of a knight, but the ghost of a system. That fear shaped policy. It influenced how certain lands were distributed, how communication routes were secured, how military orders were monitored. The shadow of the Templar structure forced the world to adapt to an enemy it could no longer see. In some cases, it wasn't fear, but imitation that marked their influence. Other secretive institutions, especially those founded in the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, borrowed the Templar model outright, not just in symbol, but in method. Hierarchical progression through ranks, vows of silence, moral testing before advancement, a blending of spiritual language with practical action. These were not just flourishes. They were functional. They offered stability in an unstable world. And whether or not these new groups fully understood their inheritance, they followed the design. Because it worked. The Templars had built something so resilient it no longer needed its origin to operate. It had become self-sustaining. Even the human memory adapted. Legends of buried treasure, of secret tunnels and undying brotherhoods are not just products of imagination. They are what remains when a structure cannot be fully erased. The mind keeps turning it over, trying to find the source. Fiction fills the gap left by redacted truth. And in that space, the Templars survive in yet another form, not as fact, not as myth, but as inevitability. We keep telling their story not because we are sure of what happened, but because something inside us senses that the structure still lives. And it does. Not in its original form, perhaps, but in function, in quiet rooms, in inherited discipline, in places where purpose still outranks ego. This is the nature of a well-designed system. It doesn't need to be remembered to endure. It just needs to be used. The greatest illusion surrounding the Templars is that they needed secrecy to survive. But the truth is more complex. Secrecy was not their strategy, it was their nature. From the beginning, their strength came not from numbers or arms, but from coherence. Every man in the order knew his place, his role, and the limits of what he was meant to know. There was no chaos, no self-promotion, only function, only duty. That kind of cohesion creates something more powerful than loyalty. It creates invisibility. Not the absence of sight, but the absence of distinction. A Templar did not need to be seen because his value came from the structure, not the self. And when the order was shattered, it was that structure, that invisibility, that walked away unharmed. It is this concept that continues to echo most clearly into the modern world. Institutions today struggle to hold coherence under pressure. Movements fracture under egos, companies falter under internal chaos, and alliances wither from the weight of self-interest. But in certain corners, small, often unnoticed, you can still find systems that mirror the old Templar design. Not in dress or dogma, but in behavior. In how meetings are conducted with no minutes. In how information flows vertically and laterally at once. In how those involved are not named on paper, yet seem to operate with quiet coordination. You see it in highly secure research labs, in diplomatic missions that don't make the news, in anonymous donors who fund generational projects without stepping forward. The Templar spirit isn't in any specific group, it's in the infrastructure of discretion. And that discretion is not passive, it's active discipline, the kind that sees far ahead, the kind that knows when to be absent. This was the Templar strength from the beginning. They never claimed a throne. They never crowned a ruler. They knew the moment you reach too high, you become a target. And so they stayed in the periphery, holding the map instead of marching in the parade. That instinct to stay behind the curtain has outlived them. Those who wield quiet influence today, who shape policy, trade, and even belief systems from a distance, are doing what the Templars perfected, influencing without owning, guiding without demanding credit. And so we must ask again, are they still here? The answer depends on what you're looking for. If you seek a building marked with a red cross, you'll find nothing. If you expect a sword raised in ceremony, you'll be disappointed. But if you look for the quiet hand that steadies without applause, the pattern that repeats beneath noise and spectacle, the structure that resists collapse by refusing to be seen, then yes, they are still here. Not as knights, but as a rhythm. If we want to understand the Templars not as relics but as architects of continuity, we must stop searching for them in history books and start observing the architecture of influence. Because that's what they mastered. Building systems that could hold, even in their absence. The Templars were not merely warriors or monks, they were systems thinkers. They understood that any mission worth defending would someday face erasure, and so they prepared not for permanence but for transmission. It's why so much of their legacy survives not in grand monuments, but in encoded rituals, in abstract structures, in patterns of movement and governance that slipped past the fire and trial and into the bloodstream of the future. Consider how they managed time. The Templar day was divided with monastic precision, every hour accounted for, every task ritualized. This wasn't just religious observance, it was operational discipline. Time, to them, was a weapon as powerful as the sword. That mindset still echoes through certain elite circles. In military operations, timekeeping is sacrosanct. In financial networks, precision is control. Even in diplomatic protocol, timing is often more critical than message. These are modern arenas, but they follow ancient logic. Not because they inherited Templar scrolls, but because they unknowingly inherited Templar habits. Structure doesn't always require lineage. It just needs replication. Then there's the matter of distance. The Templars understood that to survive in a volatile world, one must be present but not exposed. This principle guided their diplomacy, their fortifications, even their use of intermediaries. They rarely stood at the center of power, but they were always within arm's reach of it. Their commanderies acted as nodes, not just of military defense, but of intelligence and coordination. Today, that logic is alive in decentralized systems, the same design you see in cybersecurity, in certain activist networks, in quiet philanthropic trusts that hold influence far beyond what their anonymity suggests. These aren't accidents, they are the echoes of a method. Even language was used sparingly. The Templars communicated through silence as much as speech. When a structure is strong, words become secondary. That silence wasn't just a vow, it was a design principle. And you can feel it today in places where power still moves quietly. In corridors where agreements are made off record. In relationships bound not by contracts, but by decades of unspoken loyalty. The world has changed its tools, but not its needs. And wherever those needs arise, precision, discipline, discretion, you find forms that look a great deal like what the Templars left behind. So no, they do not need to return. They are already here, in shadow form, in systems that work when no one is watching, in decisions made without vanity, in structures that don't collapse because they were never built for attention in the first place. There's a reason the story of the Templars refuses to fade, even after 7 centuries of silence. It's not the legends of buried treasure or the dramatic trials in Paris. It's not even the whispered links to secret societies. It's the feeling, quiet but persistent, that something was left behind. Not lost, but folded into the architecture of the present. And perhaps that's what makes the Templar legacy so different from that of other fallen orders. Most vanish into history with their cause, their language, their structure unraveling over time. But the Templars weren't simply an institution. They were a schema, an operating system that could be reinstalled anywhere by anyone who understood the code. You didn't need to inherit it. You only needed to recognize its rhythm. And what made that rhythm so durable? It was built on tension. The Templars were not a peaceful monastic brotherhood, nor were they simple mercenaries. They lived at the edge, monks in armor, men of God trained to kill. That tension wasn't a contradiction. It was the source of their strength. It created a worldview that refused to split body from spirit, discipline from action, belief from execution. It forced those who joined to hold complexity without flinching. And that kind of thinking, nuanced, balanced, tightly bound, creates people who can navigate uncertain worlds. The Templars weren't just building for the Crusades, they were building minds capable of adapting to collapse. You can still find traces of this mindset today, not in titles, but in behavior, in how certain individuals move through volatile systems with clarity, in how some organizations endure scandal, pressure, and war by remaining rooted in a core of unshakable values, values that are not printed on a wall, but ingrained in their internal conduct. Even the language we use to describe such individuals, stoic, composed, precise, echoes the virtues that were once drilled into the Templar novice. These qualities aren't celebrated in loud ways. They aren't flashy, but they are what makes a structure last when everything around it breaks. And that's the real key. The Templars didn't just survive through escape. They survived by becoming a blueprint for resilience, a model of how to carry meaning through the storm without letting it rot. They taught that the strongest identity is not one loudly declared, but one quietly demonstrated, not in symbols, but in choices, not in fame, but in repetition. Wherever people work with purpose without needing recognition, wherever they act in alignment with something deeper than ambition, you're seeing the old rhythm pulse again. You're seeing the form without the name. So when people ask if the Templars are still here, the answer might be less about mystery and more about awareness. They are not in the shadows. They are in the structure. The most enduring systems are not preserved in vaults or carved into stone. They are passed hand to hand, wordlessly, through repetition. That was the genius of the Templars. They created a way of being that did not rely on charisma or conquest to survive. It relied on form. And form, once learned by enough people, no longer needs a name. It carries itself forward in behavior. This is why the Templar story does not feel finished, because it isn't. It has simply changed shape. From public order to private pattern, from visible symbol to invisible method. And the more you study how certain people act today, quiet, deliberate, connected by unseen lines, the more you sense the echo of that method. Even their downfall follows a pattern that has since been repeated many times in history. A structure becomes too powerful, too independent, too effective. It begins to challenge established hierarchies, not through defiance, but by simply being more competent. And so it must be broken, not out of justice, but out of fear. The charges against the Templars, heresy, idolatry, unnatural acts, were less about truth and more about destabilization. The goal was not clarity, but confusion. And confusion works best when the accused refuse to speak, when silence becomes the only form of resistance. The Templars understood this. They embraced martyrdom not out of helplessness, but as a final form of structure, a closing of the circle. And what they left behind was not a power vacuum. It was a riddle, one that has never been fully solved. Over time, this riddle attracted others, writers, mystics, strategists, even political thinkers, all trying to understand what made the Templar system so lasting. Some romanticized it, turning it into fantasy. Others feared it, imagining conspiracies behind every locked door. But what both groups sensed, correctly, was that something survived, something functional, something too stable to be accidental. And so they either chased it or tried to bury it. But the structure didn't care. It wasn't trying to be found. It was trying to continue. That continuation isn't always heroic. It doesn't wear armor. It doesn't shout. Sometimes it appears in the meticulous patience of a researcher piecing together lost knowledge. Sometimes in the quiet resistance of someone choosing principle over popularity. Sometimes in a network of people who coordinate without spectacle, without hierarchy, without ego. These are not accidents. They are the after-image of a system that taught its followers how to vanish without dying, how to protect meaning by becoming invisible. So the next time you feel drawn to a story of forgotten orders or silent architects, know that you're not just chasing myth. You're responding to a real structure that was designed to be felt, not seen. And in that feeling, the Templars are still here. If you listen closely, you'll notice that the story of the Templars doesn't sound like a collapse. It sounds like an evolution. They began as warriors, became administrators, grew into financiers, and matured into something stranger, something that didn't need a battlefield to exert power. That arc is not a fall, it's a transformation. And that transformation mirrors what many institutions strive for today, the ability to adapt without losing core identity, the ability to disappear and still function, the ability to step back from visibility while continuing to influence outcomes. In this way, the Templars did not fail. They succeeded too well, so well that the world had to find a way to absorb their methods without acknowledging their origin. This absorption happened in plain sight. One by one, the tools they developed, standardized accounting, secure travel corridors, sealed communication routes, military financial hybrid roles, were taken up by others. Monarchs borrowed them. Mercantile families imitated them. The church repurposed them. And as these tools were dispersed, they were stripped of their branding. The Red Cross was gone. The vow was gone. But the architecture remained. And once a tool proves itself indispensable, it no longer needs a name. It becomes standard practice. And in that standardization, the Templar design achieves something no conquest could provide: permanence. What's most remarkable is how little resistance this absorption encountered. Usually, when a powerful institution collapses, its knowledge is either hoarded or destroyed. But in the case of the Templars, it was quietly redistributed. No grand library was sacked. No treasure map surfaced with the secret of eternal life. Instead, the treasure was structural knowledge: how to move assets securely, how to communicate across fractured territories, how to operate in both the sacred and the secular without being devoured by either. These weren't secrets, they were blueprints. And they survived not in vaults, but in hands. You can see the echoes of this today in how complex operations function in crisis. Relief missions that move faster than governments. Intelligence agencies that navigate 10 layers of policy without public knowledge. Elite training programs that focus less on force and more on endurance, adaptability, and clarity under pressure. These are the children of that forgotten system. They may not know it, but they are continuing it. Because once a method proves itself, it doesn't go away. It becomes foundational, invisible, normal. And so the question shifts. It is no longer, did they survive, but where are they operating now, under different names? Because if the rhythm continues, so does the mission. And if the mission continues, the order, however silent, however altered, is still at work. Not in shadowy bunkers or secret tombs, but in the way the world runs when no one is watching. The story of the Templars is often told as if it ended in fire and ash, trials, confessions, executions. But what if that was only the visible death? What if the real order, the thinking, the structure, the purpose, slipped underground the moment the flames were lit? To understand this, you have to stop thinking in terms of institutions and start thinking in terms of currents. A current doesn't disappear when the river splits. It finds another path. And that's exactly what the Templar ethos did. It flowed into other forms, quietly, persistently, until it no longer needed the name to move the world. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for this current isn't in old manuscripts or dusty castles. It's in the strange web of patterns that connect otherwise unrelated organizations throughout history. Initiation rituals, codes of silence, cross-regional networks of mutual support, a blend of service and secrecy. You see it in the rise of Freemasonry, in the conduct of certain monastic orders that reappeared after the Templars' suppression. In diplomatic circles where loyalty is tested not by belief, but by discretion. These patterns do not prove continuity in a legal sense, but they suggest something deeper, a cultural memory, a kind of behavioral DNA passed down through those drawn to service without spectacle. And this memory seems to cluster around those drawn to structure. Not bureaucracy, but meaningful structure. Systems that bind people not through rules, but through responsibility. The Templars understood that when the external world is unstable, internal code becomes everything. This idea survives today in certain modern professions that are technically secular, yet operate with an almost sacred rigor. Emergency responders, ethical hackers, high-trust negotiators. These are not people chasing power, they are people upholding a rhythm. They may never utter the word Templar, but they embody the legacy. They are still, in a sense, knights, just in different armor. This is where the myth of the Templar treasure becomes a distraction. Gold and relics make for thrilling stories, but the real treasure was always method. The ability to build something that could move unseen, to set a code in motion that did not rely on public approval or religious favor. And once that code entered the bloodstream of Western civilization, it no longer needed to be hidden. It just needed to be lived. That is why, no matter how many archives you search, you'll never find the final page of the Templar story. because it isn't on paper, it's in practice. So when people speak of resurrection, of the Templars returning in some secret form, they may be looking in the wrong direction. The Templars don't need to return. They were never truly gone. They simply adapted, as all great systems do, not by shouting their presence, but by surviving through use. There is a particular kind of power that asks for no recognition. It doesn't arrive cloaked in fanfare or sealed with crests. It doesn't need to. Its influence is silent, not because it is hiding, but because it is patient. That was always the Templar model. While the world has spent centuries asking where their gold went, the real question, where their structure went, has been largely ignored. And yet that structure lives on, not as a relic of the past, but as a quiet framework undergirding parts of the present. It's not preserved in temples or tombs. It's preserved in behavior, in code, in instinct. The kind of instinct that knows when to speak and when to disappear. As the centuries rolled forward, certain institutions began to appear that seemed almost too orderly, too composed, too rooted in something older than their charters admitted. Groups that trained their members not merely in skill, but in character. Networks that operated globally without fanfare, whose impact outweighed their visibility. They often claimed no direct link to the Templars, and yet their rituals, their hierarchies, their values, loyalty, service, secrecy, whispered of a lineage they themselves might not fully understand. You could call these echoes. But echoes of what? Not a name, not a crusade, a method, a rhythm, something that survives because it's still needed. This brings us to a more unsettling possibility. What if the Templar legacy was never meant to be found? What if its ultimate design was not visibility, but absorption? The Order's final act may not have been defiance, but dispersion, its knowledge sown into the soil of the world, germinating wherever silence and structure are valued. If that's the case, then it becomes almost impossible to trace, because it was never meant to be traced. That is the nature of a truly successful clandestine system. It stops needing a name. It functions through others. It becomes substrate. Even those modern groups who claim Templar descent, who wear the regalia, recite the vows, may be missing the point. The real legacy does not reside in uniforms or ceremonies. It resides in how you think, how you organize under pressure, how you protect what matters when no one is watching. That is the inheritance. And if that inheritance has found new hosts, new practitioners, they won't necessarily look medieval. They might look like strategists, responders, architects of systems too elegant to draw attention. That is the brilliance of the original model. It didn't need to last through spectacle. It lasted through use. So we may never hold in our hands a single document that proves the Templars continued. But every time we witness calm within chaos, method within uncertainty, and humility within power, we may be seeing the silent continuation of something they began, not in costume but in code. There is a peculiar weight to a story that was never meant to end. The tale of the Templars doesn't trail off into obscurity. It fractures, refracts, and repeats itself through time in ways that seem both coincidental and intentional. It's as if their disappearance was not a conclusion, but a pivot, a turning inward. And this is where the myth begins to darken. Because when something disappears without truly dying, it doesn't become less powerful. It becomes harder to detect, harder to challenge. That ambiguity is precisely why the Templars have become a permanent fixture of suspicion, reverence, and fascination. Their very absence has become a form of presence. As rumors of their survival took root in the centuries that followed, they began to attract everything that defied easy explanation. A strange seal on a letter, an unmarked fortress with advanced engineering, a lineage of thinkers and builders who credited their inspiration to unnamed sources. Each new generation found something to project onto the Templars: anxieties about power, dreams of hidden truth, fantasies of moral guardianship. And yet, beneath the conspiracy theories and secret society fanfare, something steadier persisted: the continued relevance of their method. People weren't just fascinated by the Templars, they were drawn to how they worked, how they moved, how they endured. That endurance came from their dual nature. The Templars were both worldly and spiritual, public and private, visible and hidden. In a world that demanded binary roles, church or crown, soldier or monk, they dared to be both. That tension, that refusal to simplify, made them dangerous. And it's precisely what makes them still feel current. We live in a world that again demands simplicity. Pick a side, declare your allegiance, be legible at all times. The Templars, by contrast, cultivated complexity. They understood that true power is quiet, that most truths are layered, and that survival often depends on the ability to remain unclassified. It's no wonder, then, that modern systems built for resilience often mirror this ambiguity. Think tanks with military advisors and theologians in the same room. Foundations that fund humanitarian efforts and intelligence networks. Individuals who operate across borders, fluent in multiple domains, but loyal to none. These aren't Templars in name, but they operate in the same liminal space. They don't seek visibility, they seek effect. And like the Templars, their allegiance is not to title or nation, but to a larger pattern of continuity. So when someone asks if the Knights Templar are still here, what they might really be asking is it still possible to live like that? To serve without demanding praise? To build without leaving a signature? To belong to something sacred without ever saying its name? And if the answer is yes, then the Templars never left. They simply evolved into silence. There's a certain genius in building something that survives without needing to be seen. The Templars understood this early on, not just through their discipline, but through their infrastructure. Their commanderies were placed with strategic brilliance, acting as way stations, banks, fortresses, and sanctuaries, all at once. These were not just physical outposts. They were nodes in a network designed to carry information, wealth, and people across a fractured, dangerous world. That network did not die when the order was dismantled. Like a river finding a new channel, it adapted, redirecting its flow through new affiliations, new faces, new languages. The map changed, but the logic behind it remained untouched. Today, you can trace the same logic in digital networks, in global finance, in the decentralized movements that seem to organize without hierarchy. The concept of secure passage, of trusted exchange, of embedded sanctuaries, it's all still here. The only difference is the medium. Where once they relied on horses and parchment, today we rely on servers and encryption. But the problem is the same: how to move what matters safely through hostile terrain. The Templars cracked that code in the 12th century, and the rest of the world has been catching up ever since. But this structure wasn't just physical or procedural, it was psychological. Every Templar was trained to think a certain way, to expect betrayal, to anticipate change, to prepare for collapse. And yet, despite this grim worldview, they were builders. They didn't just guard, they created. And they did it with an eye toward longevity. That balance between caution and construction is rare. It requires a kind of dual loyalty, one to the present and one to something that may not bear fruit for centuries. You can still find that mindset today among those who work in long-term strategy, deep foundations, or legacy institutions. People who build things not for credit, but for durability. That's where the legacy becomes most compelling. Not in the rumors or the relics, but in the minds that continue the work. The minds that don't need applause, that don't seek the spotlight, that measure success not in weeks, but in generations. These are the real heirs to the Templar design, and they are more numerous than we realize. They don't wear white mantles, they don't speak of crusades, but they serve in silence, build with discipline, and wait, sometimes for years, for the right moment to act. So if the order survives, it does so not as a banner, but as a brain, a way of seeing the world, a way of building systems that outlast their builders. And if you've ever felt drawn to that kind of work, patient, purposeful, hidden, then perhaps you already know. Perhaps some part of you remembers. The deeper you go into the legacy of the Templars, the more you realize that their most powerful influence wasn't in what they claimed, but in what they refused to explain. They never published a manifesto. They didn't leave behind a grand theological treatise. Their silence was their strategy. And in that silence, they left room for continuity. Because when an idea is not bound by rigid language, it becomes flexible. It can be reborn, reinterpreted, reapplied. This is why every few decades, a new generation rediscovers the Templars, not as a finished chapter, but as an unfinished pattern. The symbols draw us in, but it's the structure beneath them that holds our attention. Because it still works. Take, for instance, their approach to loyalty. Templar allegiance wasn't to a king or to a cause. It was to a mode of operation. They obeyed commands, yes, but more importantly, they obeyed principles. Those principles could adapt to time and place. Courage without arrogance. Faith without fanaticism. Brotherhood without dependency. They trained for hardship, but they also trained for restraint. And when the world around them shifted, as it always did, they recalibrated, never clinging too tightly to the exterior forms of their identity. That's what made them resilient. That's what makes their legacy unnerving to those who seek control. Because the Templar model cannot be co-opted by spectacle. You can dress like them, recite their prayers, adopt their symbols, but unless you internalize their rhythm, you are merely echoing shadows. The rhythm is harder to imitate. It's quiet. It's disciplined. It operates even when there's no recognition. That's the test. Can you carry purpose in secret? Can you hold loyalty without applause? These questions separate the myth from the reality. And in a world increasingly addicted to visibility, the Templar ethic remains a radical alternative. We often think of their story as one of erasure, but maybe it was a strategy of retreat, a tactical withdrawal into forms that could not be targeted. After all, you cannot burn a mindset. You cannot torture a method. You can only misunderstand it. And while kings and inquisitors dismantled the outward shell, the method flowed on, into guilds, into merchant banks, into councils and codes of conduct that never bore the Templar name but always carried their signature. So here we are, centuries later, still asking the same question. Are the Templars still here? Maybe we're asking it because some part of us feels the answer already. Maybe it's not about them, but about us. About how we recognize the old code when we see it mirrored in our own choices, when we act with quiet conviction, when we serve something greater than recognition, when we build knowing we may never see the result. That's when the pattern reemerges. The myth of the Templars endures because it was never entirely a myth. It was a structure, and structures, unlike stories, don't need belief to function. They only need action. That's why, even long after the order was disbanded, something in their rhythm kept showing up, not as a loud resurgence, but as a steady reappearance. In cities where Templar commanderies once stood, new institutions rose, banks, courts, archives, all echoing their design. In families with no official ties, habits of discipline, secrecy, and service carried on. And in times of upheaval, When old systems collapsed, these fragments reassembled in strange new ways, as if some hidden schema had merely gone dormant, waiting for its next iteration. This isn't about conspiracy, it's about architecture. The Templars didn't need to survive in secret vaults. They survived the way good blueprints do, through reuse. Once a pattern of behavior proves durable, others adopt it. They copy the form, even if they don't understand the origin. That's how the Templar system moved forward, not through direct inheritance, but through silent emulation. And as that structure spread, it detached from the name. It became ambient, a mode, not a label. And that mode can be found almost anywhere if you know how to look. You find it in institutions that favor ritual over flair, that value clarity over charisma, that train their members not for glory, but for readiness. It appears in humanitarian groups that embed in conflict zones with no press coverage, in intelligence networks that operate without visible budget lines or public acknowledgement, in private foundations that move enormous resources with minimal footprint. These are not accidents. They are the logical offspring of a method designed for continuity over credit, for structure over spectacle. And at the center of this quiet architecture is the idea of containment. The Templars understood that power unanchored by discipline becomes self-destructive, so they built a rule that constrained even as it empowered. A knight could not act out of impulse. He answered to the rhythm. That rhythm survives today, not as a rule book, but as an ethic. Do what must be done, and do it without drawing fire. Stand for something, but don't stand in the spotlight. This ethic is not lost, it is just out of fashion, which in a way makes it more powerful, because those who still follow it are invisible by design. So the legacy of the Templars lives not in headlines, but in habits, in the way some people still move with intention, even when no one is watching, in the way certain institutions still hum with internal order, even when surrounded by noise. That is the quiet pulse of continuity, and it suggests that the order, or at least its rhythm, never truly ended. For centuries, the name Templar has conjured images of armored knights, secret rites, and cryptic relics buried beneath ancient chapels. But the further we drift from the medieval world, the more that image begins to dissolve, and in its place emerges something more elusive, more modern. Because the true legacy of the Templars was never just about martial prowess or sacred vows. It was about endurance without dependency, about designing a system so robust that it could survive being dismantled. And it did survive, not as a lineage, but as a language of action, a silent grammar that taught those who learned it how to function without permission, how to adapt without losing shape, and how to hold purpose even in exile. One of the most remarkable things about the order was its ability to maintain unity without uniformity. There were no sprawling declarations of doctrine. There were no icons worshipped for their own sake. Instead, there were rules, rhythms, and expectations. A man knew what was required of him, not because he was reminded with slogans, but because the structure made deviation uncomfortable. The rule of the Templars, their internal code, was not meant to inspire. It was meant to contain. And within that containment, they discovered an unexpected kind of freedom. Because once the rules were internalized, everything else became clear. The burden of decision was lifted. Focus could take root. That clarity made them dangerous, and it still does today. Because any individual or institution that can act decisively without drawing attention is more powerful than anyone notices until it's too late. You'll see this mindset today in organizations that appear immune to turbulence. They don't crash when the world shifts. They absorb, they reconfigure, they keep moving forward while others panic. These are not accidents of luck. They are reflections of a system engineered for chaos. The Templar model didn't thrive because it avoided hardship. It thrived because it expected collapse. And in that expectation, it built something few systems ever manage: the ability to survive as a shape, even when the name is erased. That's why you'll find modern echoes not in the places that claim Templar heritage, but in those that live by Templar logic. They rarely speak their allegiance. They don't decorate themselves with ancient crests, but they move with the same interior gravity: quiet, focused, durable. What makes this legacy so hard to trace is that it does not depend on inheritance. It depends on recognition. If you feel it, you feel it. If you see the structure, you can step into it. And once you've stepped in, it begins to shape how you act, how you manage time, how you choose allies, how you respond to uncertainty. It becomes not a costume, but a compass. And in that sense, the Templars never truly needed to be remembered. They only needed to be repeated. Not all legacies are written in stone. Some are encoded in the way people behave when no one is watching. That, more than any preserved relic or ancient manuscript, is where the essence of the Templar still resides. Their greatest strength was not in their arms or armor, but in how they operated as a living code, one designed to continue without central control. It's why, after their formal suppression in the early 14th century, there was no final chapter. The structure dispersed, but the behavior remained. It clung to the minds and movements of those who had once been part of it. And over time, it seeded itself into other systems, not by conquest, but by quiet imitation. An imitation, when it works, becomes indistinguishable from origin. The modern world isn't full of men on horseback defending pilgrim roads, but it is full of danger, uncertainty, and the need for trust in hostile environments. It's full of borderless crises, of networks rather than nations, of informal codes that survive where formal rules collapse. That is the world the Templars were made for. And in many ways, they anticipated it. Their order was a hybrid: military, monastic, financial, diplomatic. They moved across empires without allegiance to a single crown. They carried knowledge, wealth, and intelligence through fractured territories that hated each other, and yet somehow they were welcomed, or at least tolerated, in nearly all of them. That's not just power, that's adaptability, that's institutional fluency. And now, centuries later, we see groups and individuals following similar paths, operating in global gray zones, bridging divides that politics cannot, NGOs that cross battle lines, crisis responders who act without waiting for permission, intelligence handlers who move between faith and state without ever declaring which they serve more. They may not cite the Templars as inspiration, but the method is there. The rhythm. The ability to survive not by being strongest, but by being most prepared. Even culturally, we feel the draw. The resurgence of interest in the Templars, from novels to video games, from documentaries to speculative theories, suggests something deeper than curiosity. It suggests longing. A hunger for a structure that is both purposeful and silent, that binds without blinding, that serves without spectacle. We are surrounded by noise, and the Templars offer an image of clarity. Not moral purity, not romantic chivalry, but a kind of disciplined silence. And in that silence, many of us see something worth reviving, even if we don't fully understand it. So, the Templars may not need to return in the flesh. They already returned in form. And if we're paying attention, we can find them not by looking backward, but by watching for those who live by a code they do not advertise. Those who move with intention, who act when others hesitate, and who disappear just before the world realizes what they've done. To study the Templars is to walk a narrow corridor between myth and method. On one side, you have centuries of rumor, secret tunnels beneath cathedrals, hidden scrolls locked away in remote vaults, bloodlines protected by coded marriages. On the other, you have the quieter, steadier truth, an order that learned how to structure loyalty across borders, time zones, and empires. That second story doesn't get as much attention, but it's far more powerful, because it explains not just why the Templars lasted, but why their disappearance didn't end their influence. They built something that worked too well to be forgotten. And what they built wasn't just a hierarchy, it was a way of thinking. Templars were trained to operate without needing to ask for help. They were drilled not only in combat, but in logistics, finance, language, and law. Each man was expected to be a node of competence, self-contained, but aligned with the whole. That kind of training creates something rare: decentralized unity. It's a model most modern systems struggle to achieve. Bureaucracies collapse under their own weight, and decentralized movements fracture without cohesion. The Templars walked the razor's edge between both and left behind a blueprint for others to follow. That blueprint, over time, detached from its creators. And that may have been the intention all along. Once a method can be passed without relying on lineage, it becomes more durable. It doesn't require a temple. It doesn't require a charter. It only requires recognition. Someone who sees the shape and steps into it. That's how legacy becomes living memory. Not by being preserved, but by being reenacted. And the reenactment doesn't have to be exact. It just has to be true in spirit. That spirit survives in fields you might not expect, in the structure of certain special forces units, in the design of resilient nonprofits, in the internal codes of engineers, field agents, and archivists who understand that precision matters even when no one's looking. And this is the real answer to why the Templars continue to haunt the edge of our imagination. They represent the idea that a group can be powerful without being loud, faithful without being rigid, enduring without being nostalgic. In a world that rewards spectacle and speed, the Templars remind us of the long game, of structure over spin, of purpose over performance. And that's why their ghost lingers, not as something we've lost, but as something we may need again. So maybe we should stop asking where they went and start asking where their methods now live. Because they do live. In quiet teams, in hidden hands, in the work of those who don't speak first, but act with precision. That is the rhythm. That is the code. The further we trace the Templar legacy, the more we begin to realize that survival isn't always about resistance. Sometimes it's about absorption. The Templars weren't simply dismantled, they were metabolized. Their structures, techniques, and philosophies were quietly consumed by the very systems that had once feared them. And in that strange act of institutional cannibalism, the order disappeared in form, but not in function. What had once been branded as a threat became a blueprint, not out of admiration, but out of necessity. Because even their enemies could not deny that the Templars had mastered something others desperately needed: continuity under pressure. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, even accidental. A former Templar taken into the service of a prince. A financial method once used for pilgrim protection, now adopted by a royal treasury. An oath of secrecy, once uttered in a chapel, now embedded in a private council's code of conduct. Piece by piece, the order's knowledge spread, not through loyalty to its name, but through the quiet logic of utility. And over time, that utility became tradition. And tradition, when repeated long enough, becomes identity. Not personal identity, but structural identity. The kind that doesn't wear armor or recite Latin, but still moves with the same precision. That structural identity can be seen today in places few would expect. Not in dusty temples or secret lodges, but in modern institutions designed to hold contradictory forces in tension. Elite units trained to act autonomously within a rigid chain of command. Financial systems that can pivot across borders while maintaining a shared language of trust. Non-governmental organizations that operate like secular monastic orders, dedicated to service and bound by internal discipline. These are not Templars in the romantic sense, but they are inheritors of the model. And the model is what mattered most, because what the Templars left behind wasn't a faith, but a framework, a way to operate in the world without being consumed by it, a rhythm of discretion, duty, and adaptability. And that rhythm continues wherever people are trained, not just in action, but in purpose, wherever silence is used not to conceal, but to concentrate, wherever legacy is measured not in headlines, but in the durability of systems quietly handed from one generation to the next. So are the Knights Templar still here? Not in the way fiction imagines them, but in the way legacy actually works, quietly, invisibly, through form. And perhaps that's what they intended all along, to disappear so thoroughly that their work could continue unchallenged. Not because it was secret, but because it no longer needed to be spoken. If you were searching for the Templars today, you wouldn't find them where the cameras point. You wouldn't find them in the headlines or even in the dusty archives of ancient cathedrals. You'd find them in the places where complexity is tamed in silence, in the quiet offices where strategic maps are drawn for events that never make the news, in the training grounds where endurance is taught not through pride, but through repetition. You'd find them in systems built not for attention, but for resilience. And most of all, you'd find them in the people who don't call themselves Templars, but live by codes that carry their spirit. We've reached a moment in history where the idea of secret orders often gets confused with spectacle. Conspiracies draw attention like moths to flame, and anything that whispers of control behind the curtain becomes instant fodder for the imagination. But the truth is rarely that cinematic. The truth is usually embedded in function. The real Templar legacy didn't vanish into mystery. It vanished into usefulness. And once something becomes useful enough, it stops being a mystery and starts being standard. That's the mark of true influence. It stops needing to wear its original name. That's why the most enduring parts of their system were the least glamorous. A system of decentralized command. A culture of trust built through ritual, not hierarchy. A deep respect for silence, not as absence, but as attention. These were not just quirks of a medieval order. They were elements of a scalable design. And long after their banners were burned and their leaders killed, that design went on. Through mercantile alliances, through military schools, through non-religious groups who still use initiations, hierarchies, and sacred texts. Not for control, but for clarity. Even within the church, echoes remain. Not in the doctrine, but in the architecture of discipline. The idea that mission must be balanced by humility, that visibility weakens the sacred, that truth, when repeated too often, becomes vulnerable to corruption. These were not ideas invented by the Templars, but they were ideas the Templars embodied so thoroughly that their memory could not be erased. Even when the church tried, even when the state insisted. Some rhythms are too embedded to be scrubbed out. So no, you won't find a Templar riding through the fog on a white horse, but you might find someone in a modern uniform, carrying the same weight of unspoken duty. You might find someone designing structures meant to last, not to be seen. And you might feel, if you're paying attention, the faint pulse of a method that has never quite stopped working. We often imagine that when something vanishes from history, it leaves a void. But sometimes, what looks like an ending is just a transformation. A shift so complete that the original form becomes unrecognizable, even while its essence endures. The Templars didn't vanish. They changed shape, and in doing so, they became harder to destroy. Because how do you kill something that no longer needs a name? How do you erase a pattern that survives not in symbols or titles, but in function? The order was broken apart, yes, but the pieces were small enough, strong enough, and dispersed widely enough that the logic lived on. Quiet, adaptable, waiting. This adaptability is what makes them feel so modern. The Templars anticipated a world where traditional borders and loyalties would blur, where faith and pragmatism would need to coexist, and where institutions would need to endure storm after storm without crumbling under their own weight. That's the real genius of what they built, not in the sacred relics they protected, but in the operational code they left behind. A blueprint for survival through disciplined flexibility. A map of how to remain rooted while being able to shift quickly, quietly, and completely when necessary. In today's world, we often mistake visibility for relevance. Influence is measured by followers, algorithms, and reach. But the Templar legacy reminds us that some of the most powerful forces work best when they stay beneath the surface. The quiet planner in the war room, the anonymous donor who keeps a foundation running, the civil servant who understands that the best laws are the ones that need no enforcement. These aren't Templars in any literal sense, but they're moving in the same current. They are guided by structure, trained in silence, and measured by how long their work lasts, not how loudly it's praised. The question of whether the Templars still exist isn't just about tracing bloodlines or decoding symbols etched into stone. It's about learning how to see like they did, to recognize when a system is strong because it doesn't need recognition, to understand that endurance often comes not from making yourself known, but from becoming indispensable. The real Templar influence is not in what's claimed, it's in what persists. And what persists, always, is structure. When it works, it survives. When it survives long enough, it spreads. So perhaps the more relevant question isn't whether the Templars are still here. It's whether we are still capable of carrying what they carried. Not their swords, not their shields, but their discipline. Their ability to act in service of something bigger than themselves without waiting for approval. If that lives on, and in some places it surely does, then the Templars never left at all. What truly defines an order is not its beginning, nor even its moment of greatest glory, but how it handles its own disappearance. The Templars, for all their discipline and power, did not fight to the last man when their time came. There was no final battlefield, no desperate last stand. Instead, what followed the suppression of the order in 1307 was something far more subtle and far more telling. There was retreat, yes. There was imprisonment, betrayal, and execution. But there was also diffusion. Not the dramatic end that history books tend to favor, but a quiet dissolving into the wider body of European life. Their lands were seized, their leaders tried and condemned, yet the rhythm of their system continued to beat, faintly, invisibly, in new hands. This vanishing act was not just a fluke of history, it was a strategy. The order had always been more than its name. Its members were trained to function in silence, to operate without glory. When the grand design was shattered, those who had embodied the code simply moved on, carrying their knowledge into the folds of other institutions. Some joined other monastic orders. Some embedded themselves in royal courts. Others vanished entirely, but they didn't forget how they had lived. And so the architecture of the Templar mind, its compartmentalization, its discipline, its commitment to duty without display, migrated into new structures. The centuries that followed are littered with strange correspondences. A royal treasurer who structures a national banking system with uncanny Templar efficiency. A military unit that organizes its command lines in a strikingly familiar hierarchy. A philanthropic guild that blends secrecy, service, and ritual in ways that evoke something older than themselves. These are not proof of conspiracy. They are proof of a blueprint. Once a way of working shows itself to be effective, especially under pressure, it tends to reappear. Not because someone forced it to, but because someone remembered. Or, perhaps more accurately, someone intuited the same path again. This is why the Templar question refuses to die. It is not that we expect to find them behind every locked door. It is that we keep encountering systems that look like them, institutions that feel like them, patterns of control, trust, and service that seem too precise to be accidental. It is not proof we chase, it is recognition. And recognition is its own kind of truth. Because the real power of a model like the Templars is that it can survive in pieces, scattered across time and place, yet still function in full when those pieces reassemble, quietly, invisibly, and without needing to explain themselves. So when someone asks if the Knights Templar are still here, the answer is not in symbols or documents. It's in systems that keep working, even after everyone forgets who built them. Every empire leaves ruins. Every institution, no matter how vast, eventually crumbles. But the Templars did not leave behind ruins in the usual sense. Their castles and commanderies still stand in many places, weathered but intact. Their archives, where they survived, remain enigmatic, more notable for what they omit than what they reveal. What they truly left behind, however, cannot be visited with a tour guide or photographed for a history book. Their most enduring creation was immaterial, a strategy for survival through disbandment. They learned how to vanish, not out of fear, but out of design. And that design has outlived almost every other order of its kind. The genius of the Templars wasn't in secrecy for its own sake. It was in the way they used secrecy to create mobility. By limiting what could be seen, what could be targeted, they allowed their most essential functions to pass undisturbed through upheaval. That philosophy didn't end with the trials and executions. It entered the bloodstream of other institutions, subtly, untraceably. The language of discipline, the rituals of trust, the layered roles that allowed an agent to serve in multiple worlds at once. These things were not inventions unique to the Templars, but they mastered them in a way few others did. And because they mastered them, others began to copy their rhythm, sometimes consciously, often not. Because once a model proves it can weather collapse, it becomes valuable in a way no ideology or artifact ever could. This is what we see in the centuries that followed, a pattern of recurrence. Intelligence networks modeled on their decentralized communication, charitable foundations with strict codes of conduct echoing monastic vows, even private military orders, not born of religious conviction, but of strategy, adopting a code of internal silence and shared purpose. These are not coincidences. They are evolutions of a functional design. What makes this also difficult to trace is that the Templar legacy does not announce itself. It does not wear regalia. It does not ask for credit. It is encoded in process, not proclamation. And so it slips past the eye of most historians, most theorists, most governments, but not all. Some still can sense when a structure has been inherited, when a method survives the loss of its origin. And those few understand that the Templar model is not about past glory, it is about future endurance. So the real question isn't whether the Templars are still among us, it's whether their mindset still has a place in the world we are building. A world that may yet need silence, structure, service without spectacle. And if we do need those things, then it means their time never truly ended. If you listen carefully to the stories surrounding the Templars, you'll start to hear a pattern, a kind of rhythm in the way they vanish and reappear across time. It's never in full view, never in a straight line. Instead, they flicker along the edges of history, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in strange similarities between systems built centuries apart. A treasury here that echoes their financial models, a code of behavior there that reads like a secular version of their rule. It's as if the order did not simply collapse. It seeded itself into the soil of the modern world. And what grew from that seed often bore little resemblance to the white-mantled Knights of Jerusalem, but everything in common with the discipline, secrecy, and precision that once defined them. The secret to their endurance was never just secrecy itself, it was their mastery of tension between visible and invisible, faith and pragmatism, obedience and autonomy. They trained their minds as much as their bodies. A Templar wasn't just a soldier, he was a node in a larger system, expected to act independently when needed, and yet always in harmony with the whole. That kind of training doesn't simply disappear. When you teach generations of men how to function under pressure without orders, you're teaching something far deeper than tactics. You're shaping a worldview. And worldviews, once embedded, have a strange way of outlasting their original context. That worldview, stoic, silent, purposeful, finds its way into places even the Templars themselves could not have imagined. Into the corridors of think tanks, into the black budgets of military intelligence, into small nonprofits that operate in disaster zones with the same kind of mission clarity that once guided knights across desert sands. These aren't secret cabals reenacting ancient rituals. They are modern echoes of a logic that once helped a handful of warrior monks become a continental force. And they echo because they work. Because in a chaotic world, the ability to hold still, to act cleanly, to retreat without collapse, that's power. And power tends to be borrowed, adapted, and carried forward. And yet the Templars are also myth. They exist as much in our minds as in any archive. That, too, is part of their strength. Because myth is immune to precision. It spreads, it transforms, and it survives, even where the facts fade. And in that space between reality and imagination, the order remains alive in a different form, as symbol, as archetype, as the embodiment of something we instinctively feel the modern world lacks. Order without tyranny, power without chaos, faith without dogma. So maybe the question isn't whether the Templars still walk among us. Maybe the question is whether we still know how to walk like them, whether we still recognize the value of restraint, of discipline, of mission without noise. Because if that recognition lives on, even in fragments, then so do they. Every now and then, a document surfaces, a letter, a ledger, a fragment of parchment tucked into the back of an old registry. And in these fragments are traces, small but distinct, of the way the Templars moved through the world. Not the myths, not the stories of hidden gold or sacred bloodlines, but the real mechanics of their work. A transaction recorded in meticulous shorthand. A property transfer conducted through a third party whose name appears nowhere else in the archive. A code of conduct copied almost verbatim into the rules of a merchant guild a century later. These are not the artifacts of conspiracy. They are the fingerprints of a system designed to be copied, reshaped, and passed on without attribution. The most effective systems do not advertise themselves. They replicate in silence. And that is exactly what the Templar framework was built to do. When the arrests began in 1307, many of the order's most prominent leaders were caught off guard, but the system they had built was not. Decentralized command structures, hidden financial networks, parallel channels of communication. These mechanisms absorbed the shock of persecution and kept functioning, not under the banner of the Red Cross, but through the movements of those who had internalized the rhythm. Men who no longer needed the title Templar to act like one. You can see this after the fall, in the strange places where Templar influence appears to rematerialize. In Portugal, where the Order of Christ emerged with striking similarities to the old Templar rule. In Scotland, where fugitive knights found refuge among local lords and, some say, left marks on early Masonic rituals. In maritime trade, where the Templar knowledge of safe routes, coded messages, and risk management quietly slipped into the DNA of shipping guilds and banking houses. These were not accidents, they were absorptions, rebirths, not under the same name, but through the same logic. And what of today? Today, the fragments are harder to trace, but they're there, in the rules followed by elite military units that prioritize moral clarity under pressure, in the organizational structures of international aid groups that rely on silence, sacrifice, and service as much as strategy, in the private archives that keep secrets not for profit, but for protection. These are not theatrical recreations of the past. They are living echoes. Not because the Templars wrote themselves into history, but because they designed themselves to survive its erasure. So when you wonder whether the Knights Templar are still here, perhaps stop looking for robes and swords. Look for discipline. Look for silence that protects rather than conceals. Look for institutions that move with purpose even when no one is watching. That is where the order still breathes, not in the spotlight, but in the scaffolding of systems that endure. The disappearance of the Templars was never clean. History likes sharp endings, dates that close a chapter, executions that punctuate a fall. But the truth is rarely so tidy. The papal bull that disbanded the order didn't erase the men who lived by its code. It didn't burn their knowledge, their instincts, or the networks they'd built over decades. And so, rather than a disappearance, what followed was a diffusion. The system bled outward, not in retreat, but in quiet expansion. Not with banners, but with habits. It was not the end of something, it was the scattering of a pattern. Many of the knights who survived the suppression were absorbed into other orders, both religious and secular. Others simply disappeared from the records, their names buried in obscure notarial books or faded land titles. Yet the rhythm of their conduct, their discipline, their discretion, their rigor, began to show up elsewhere. In the rules of the Teutonic Knights, in the architecture of certain financial institutions, in the ceremonial protocols of brotherhoods that emerged long after the last Templar fortress fell. These institutions did not call themselves Templar. They didn't need to. They carried the same design logic in their bones. The enduring legacy of the Templars was never just in their theology or their military conquests. It was in the way they structured time, trust, and training. A knight was not judged by belief alone, but by behavior under pressure. That structure proved to be unusually replicable. Over centuries, it was adopted, revised, and embedded into institutions that required quiet loyalty and internal stability, qualities that rarely appear in the headlines, but often define who survives in times of chaos. Even the myths that grew around the Templars reflect this strange endurance. Conspiracies may seem fanciful, but they're rooted in a deeper truth, the sense that something remained after the official end. That the order was not so much destroyed as disguised. And perhaps that's not a distortion, but an intuition. Because something did remain, not the knights, but the algorithm. Not the relics, but the rhythm. And so we arrive in the modern world, where much has changed and yet the deepest challenges remain eerily familiar. Information moves faster, but trust is rarer. Power is global, but fragmented. Institutions rise quickly, but rarely last. In such a world, the Templar model, quiet, disciplined, networked, feels less like a relic and more like a prototype. And those who still follow that model, whether they know it or not, are walking in the shadow of something old and enduring. To understand the persistence of the Templars is to understand the nature of architecture, not just of buildings, but of belief, of behavior, of systems that shape people even after their designers have long disappeared. The Templars didn't just build commanderies or chapels, they built habits. They trained men to respond predictably under pressure, to move independently within rigid structures, to guard information as if their lives depended on it. And that kind of architecture is not easily destroyed. It stays in the hands of those trained within it. It gets passed down not through records, but through rhythm, through repeated action, through unspoken expectations, through the quiet nod of someone who sees the structure even when it's hidden. That is why so many later institutions feel familiar, even if they bear no overt trace of the order. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, military orders repurposed under royal charters, fraternal societies that rose in the Enlightenment with initiations, ranks, and codes of silence. These are not literal descendants, but they carry the DNA of a way of thinking, a way of organizing people around shared discipline and concealed knowledge. Even intelligence agencies, in their reliance on compartmentalization and loyalty forged through ordeal, reflect the Templar imprint more than they might ever admit. Yet the true Templar legacy goes even deeper. It lives in the spaces between institutions, in the idea that loyalty can transcend nation, that purpose can be forged without applause, and that systems of trust, when built correctly, can endure long after the original mission fades. This was the real innovation of the Templars, not just protecting pilgrims or managing property, but creating a transnational system of cooperation in a deeply fragmented world. In many ways, they were the first networked order in Western history. And once that kind of network is built, its pathways can be reused long after the names change. And what of today? Today we find ourselves again in a world of fragmentation, of digital empires, of divided allegiances, of institutions that feel both powerful and precarious. In such a world, the appeal of the Templars is not nostalgia, it's hunger. Hunger for a model that prizes clarity without noise, that prioritizes endurance over visibility, that trusts in something more lasting than the next news cycle. That hunger draws people back to the Templar myth, yes, but also to the Templar method. And that method, once recognized, begins to reshape how we think about service, discipline, and silence. So the next time someone asks if the Templars still exist, consider the question not in terms of names, but in terms of patterns. The pattern is alive. The rhythm has never stopped. It flows through the hands of those who build without needing credit, who protect without announcing their task, and who disappear before anyone thinks to thank them. In the quiet corners of certain libraries, behind locked cabinets and mislabeled manuscripts, there are still records that speak, though not loudly, of a presence that never fully left. Not in grand declarations, but in echoes. Correspondence between men who claimed no title but shared a peculiar syntax. Seals affixed with symbols no longer recognized, but once feared. Ledgers written in cipher, buried in estate archives, showing the quiet transfer of resources across borders long after the Templars were thought dissolved. These fragments do not shout, they hum, and if you know how to listen, they sound very much like continuity. There are patterns in history that resist easy erasure. The Templars mastered this. When suppression came, they did not resist with force alone. They retreated into the very structures they helped build. Ecclesiastical bodies, secular courts, maritime guilds, financial systems. Each provided cover. Each absorbed pieces of their protocol. And so, instead of being destroyed, the order was diluted, its name removed, but its methods retained. This is why, even centuries later, their silhouette still haunts the architecture of power. You may not see the knights, but you feel the design. And in some cases, more than just the design remained. In parts of Portugal and Spain, successors were quietly granted continuance under new banners. The Order of Christ in Portugal is perhaps the most direct example, its members drawn from surviving Templars, its assets a direct inheritance. But even outside these formal rebrandings, there were men who kept the rule not because it was enforced, but because it was embedded. They lived quietly, serving as stewards, navigators, cartographers, and advisors. And through these men, the order became something more diffuse, but no less real. In the modern era, the question of whether the Templars still exist often devolves into speculation. hidden vaults, coded messages, secret meetings beneath cathedrals. But the truth is quieter. It's in how certain organizations seem to function on old rhythms, how certain philosophies seem to emerge from nowhere, already fully formed. It's in the recurrence of values that sound almost archaic: duty, restraint, service, but prove indispensable when crisis arrives. These are not accidents, they are legacies, and legacies do not vanish because someone declared them over. They vanish only when no one remembers how they worked. So yes, the order may be gone in the sense that it no longer issues commanderies or collects tithes. But if you think of it instead as a living manuscript, rewritten with each generation by those who understand its language, then it has never gone silent. It waits, as it always has, for those with ears to hear and hands steady enough to continue the pattern. By the time we reach the modern day, the idea of the Knights Templar has long since passed from history into something more fluid, more elusive. They are myth and metaphor, symbol and suspicion. But perhaps that is the final trick of their legacy, that their most enduring presence would not be physical at all, but psychological. They no longer require a fortress, a treasury, or even a banner to command attention. They exist now in the imagination of the world, lodged deep in our cultural memory as the embodiment of disciplined secrecy, unshakable purpose, and the quiet architecture of power. What was once a military monastic order has become a cipher, emptied of specifics but still carrying weight. You can see the traces in the way we speak about control, the instinctive unease people feel when systems seem too smooth, too quiet, too durable, the way conspiracy theories magnetize around the image of a hidden order that outlasted popes and kings. But even beneath the noise, there is something else. A question we keep asking. What if someone still remembers how the old world worked? What if there are still hands, invisible but steady, nudging the gears behind the curtain? We don't just fear that possibility. Some of us long for it. In a world that feels increasingly unstable, the myth of the Templars offers not control, but continuity. But perhaps it is not myth at all. Perhaps it is simply the echo of a design that was too effective to vanish. When you build a system that rewards integrity, that trains its members to act without recognition, and that prioritizes internal structure over external validation, you are not creating a temporary institution. You are creating a method that can be replicated, even unconsciously, and that method may live on not in secret vaults or coded texts, but in how certain people work, in how they organize, in what they refuse to explain. That is the true legacy, not the treasure, not the relics, but the rhythm. It is the rhythm of trust, earned in silence, of action without spectacle, of conviction without publicity. It moves through our world in places where efficiency and loyalty still matter, where institutions are built to outlast their founders, and where oaths are kept even when there is no longer anyone to enforce them. That rhythm does not need to be called Templar, but it is. So when you ask if the Knights Templar are still here, you are asking something bigger than whether a name survived. You are asking whether discipline, silence, and structure can still thrive in a world addicted to noise. And if they can, then yes, they are still here. There's something almost architectural about the Templars' legacy, not just in the buildings they left behind, those austere commanderies, round churches, and fortified strongholds, but in the way they designed systems to outlive them. They understood, perhaps better than any other group of their time, that permanence isn't built on power alone. It's built on pattern, on discipline passed down through layers, on rituals so ingrained they continue even when their original purpose has been forgotten. What they constructed was not merely a military force or a religious institution, it was a blueprint. And blueprints, when well made, tend to be reused. After the official dissolution of the order, the traces of that blueprint began surfacing in unlikely places. Merchant banking systems began to mirror the Templar model of deposit and withdrawal by coded agreement. Military academies developed internal hierarchies that echoed the structure of the temple. Even the idea of a professional class of warrior, loyal not to a feudal lord, but to an ideal, found new life in elite corps across Europe. These were not acts of nostalgia. They were responses to need. The world remembered the way the Templars worked, even if it forgot their names. That forgetfulness is important. It's part of how the Templar design survives. It's easier to carry forward a system once it's been stripped of its name. No heresy trials, no inquisitions, just clean, usable mechanics. How to build loyalty, how to coordinate across vast distances, how to operate with a shared sense of honor without central control. These are the pieces of their architecture that proved most durable. And in time, they blended so seamlessly into other institutions that the question of who built them became irrelevant. But there are moments, quiet, strange moments, when the pattern becomes visible again. A private organization operating with anonymous benefactors, bound by internal codes no one outside is allowed to read. A global movement coordinated not through publicity, but through shared values enforced by invisible hands. A ceremonial gesture that looks at first like mere tradition, until you realize it matches a forgotten rite from a vanished order. These are not coincidences, they are recurrences. And in them, the shape of the old order flickers briefly into view. So no, the Templars are not hiding in the shadows waiting to reclaim a throne. But their model, their architecture of silence and strength, never truly fell. It simply shifted from identity to utility, from presence to influence. And in that shift, they achieved what so many orders never could, a legacy that needs no monument because it has already been built into the foundation of things that last. Walk through the ruins of a Templar commandery, and you might be tempted to see an ending. The broken walls, the overgrown courtyards, the altar stones worn smooth by centuries of wind and silence, it all feels like a tomb. But listen longer, and you begin to feel something else. These places were never built for glory. They were built for endurance. Every archway, every passage was part of a system designed not just for worship or war, but for rhythm, the rhythm of a life measured by structure, of a code carried not in words, but in actions repeated until they became instinct. And instinct, unlike architecture, does not crumble with time. It moves on, carried in the bones of those who once belonged to something greater than themselves. When the Templars vanished from public life, their buildings were seized, their titles revoked, their symbols outlawed. But those who had lived by their rule did not vanish in kind. Many took up new names, new roles, but brought with them the same habits, the same way of seeing the world through systems, obligation, and discipline. They became advisors to kings, founders of banks, leaders of guilds, and eventually even teachers in new institutions that no longer bore a cross but still demanded loyalty. The stone had fallen, but the pattern had not. And perhaps that's why we keep returning to them. Not because of what they once were, but because of what they've become, an idea that outgrew its own skin. We don't need the medieval armor or sacred relics to feel their presence. We sense it every time we encounter a structure that runs too smoothly, a tradition that's too precise, a silence that seems to hold meaning. There are patterns in the modern world that whisper of older orders, not because they copied them, but because they inherited a need for the same structure. In a world drowning in chaos and spectacle, there's something hauntingly reassuring about the thought that someone, somewhere, still remembers how to move with discipline, that some people still take vows in private, still train without fanfare, still serve without asking for recognition. Whether or not they wear a red cross on their chest, they carry something of the Templar spirit, not in title, but in temperament. So when the ruins crumble and the history fades, the legacy continues, not in any grand resurgence, but in the quiet persistence of a rhythm that refuses to die. And that's what makes their story so enduring. They taught us that disappearance is not defeat, that the deepest structures outlive their stones, and that silence, when chosen, is not absence, but strength. In every age, there are those who stand apart, not because they speak louder, but because they move differently. They make choices that don't demand attention, take paths that bend, away from power, yet seem always to find influence. Their loyalty runs deep, often silent. Their lives are defined less by what they accumulate and more by what they protect. These are the inheritors of a vanished rhythm, not bound by bloodline or title, but shaped by the same internal geometry that once guided the Knights Templar. They do not wear armor or carry swords, but their strength is no less real. They know how to listen, how to wait, how to act with intention. And if you look carefully, you can still find them at the edges of institutions, behind the doors that do not advertise themselves. There's a phrase used in old military orders: fidelity without fame. It was the kind of virtue the Templars prized above all. A life lived in service of something larger without the need for recognition. That idea didn't die with the order. It slipped into other codes of law, of secrecy, of discipline. It's the same force that shapes those who train in silence, who lead without titles, who build systems meant to last longer than their own lives. In this way, the Templars succeeded not just in defending a cause, but in transmitting a blueprint for the kind of person the world forgets it needs until everything begins to unravel. Over the centuries, that blueprint has taken on new forms: a counselor working behind the scenes to keep a nation from falling into conflict, a financier who quietly preserves a system others try to exploit, a teacher who shapes students not just through facts, but through presence. These are not heroes in the conventional sense. They do not seek to be remembered, but they act with the same inner compass that once turned a band of knights into something much larger than the sum of its parts. And just like the Templars, they do so with the knowledge that impact is not always measured in monuments, but in continuity. That continuity, delicate but persistent, is the Templars' greatest achievement. Their story is not about survival through force. It's about transmission through example. They showed that the most enduring legacies are not built on noise or conquest, but on quiet resolve and unbreakable patterns. And those patterns live on in the way people still form bonds of trust, still keep to silent codes, still believe in serving without reward. The order may have been buried by papal decree, but its shape remains, etched into the world not as a relic, but as a rhythm. So perhaps they are still here, not behind the veil of conspiracy, but in plain sight, living by the same rules, asking for nothing, enduring everything. There's something uncanny about how often the Templars return, not through facts, but through questions. They surface in quiet speculation, in theories whispered between scholars and seekers, in symbols carved where no explanation seems to fit. It's as though we're drawn not just to their history, but to the space they left behind. That absence feels intentional, designed, as if the order didn't simply disappear. They receded deliberately to test whether the world could remember a shape without needing to see its outline. And strangely, the world has. We recall them not for the details of their battles or the riches they allegedly hoarded, but for the feeling that someone once knew how to hold chaos at bay through discipline, through silence, through structure that never broke. As the centuries passed, the institutions that borrowed from the Templar pattern began to flourish, and then, just like the order itself, fade from clarity. Some were swallowed by revolution, others by irrelevance. But a few managed to persist by embracing the same lesson the Templars had learned too late, that to survive in a world built on shifting loyalties and watchful powers, you must live between the lines. The ones who understood this didn't try to revive the Templars outright. They didn't wear the robes or march under the cross. They adopted the rhythm, not the robe. They became shadows that served structure. And in doing so, they outlived every threat to their continuity. And perhaps that is why we are still fascinated. Not because of what the Templars were, but because of what they hinted we might still become. In a time where noise consumes everything, where even ideas are bought and sold like commodities, there remains something noble, almost radical, about the thought of men who chose to disappear, not for fear, but for clarity. Men who trained without spectacle, who lived by codes stronger than any flag, and who were willing to vanish in service of something they knew the world might not yet be ready to understand. That disappearance wasn't surrender, it was design. And in that design is a warning. The most powerful things in the world are often those we cannot see. So when you hear the old stories of hidden archives, of rituals in stone, of bloodlines stretching into secret societies, don't rush to prove or disprove them. Instead, ask what it means that those stories keep returning, that the world keeps needing the idea of the Templars long after their official end. Maybe what we're searching for isn't evidence. Maybe it's memory. The memory of a time when structure was sacred, when service was silent, and when loyalty meant more than self. In the earliest days of the Templars, before their name carried weight, before kings trusted them and popes feared them, they were simply men with a purpose. They protected pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem, roads that were lawless, bloodied, and quiet. Their strength came not from how many they were, but from how completely they gave themselves to the task. The vows they took were absolute: poverty, chastity, obedience. But beyond that, there was something harder to define: an inner alignment, a clarity of purpose that fused their identities into something more than soldiers, more than monks. That fusion is what set them apart. And it is that same fusion that still haunts our imagination today. Centuries later, in a world with no holy land to defend and no papal armies to command, that clarity is rare. We live in an age of divided loyalties, short attention spans, and constant noise. Yet still, the symbol of the Templar Knight persists, not because we need warriors in white cloaks, but because we crave the structure that shaped them. That structure, simple, disciplined, service-bound, is strangely absent from much of the modern world. And so the question lingers, not just whether the Templars still exist, but whether we are capable of becoming like them again. But perhaps that's the wrong question. The better one might be, did they ever really leave? Their code, their internal architecture, did not die with their arrest warrants. It was too effective, too transferable. The men who had trained under that system went on to build things in its image, not always consciously, but faithfully. The idea that loyalty could bind strangers, that training could override fear, that sacrifice could be sacred. These ideas embedded themselves in the structures that followed: military academies, intelligence services, humanitarian orders, even philosophical brotherhoods. They all, in some way, echo the Templar rhythm. We feel this rhythm in the stories we tell, in the reverence we reserve for those who act without applause, in the tension we feel between power and principle. The Templars live on not because they were perfect, they were far from it, but because they represent a paradox we still hunger to resolve: how to be powerful without becoming corrupt, how to serve without being consumed, how to disappear without being forgotten. These are not historical questions. They are personal. They are now. So yes, the order fell, but the form remained. And in every person who finds meaning in structure, who trains with intention, who serves quietly while the world roars, something of the Templars still breathes. There's a curious phenomenon in history. Some organizations grow so large, so feared, so entangled in power, that when they fall, their absence leaves behind a vacuum. And into that vacuum flows myth. For the Knights Templar, their destruction in the early 14th century was not the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a question that still hasn't been fully answered. What happened to the ones who disappeared? The ones who weren't captured, weren't executed, weren't stripped of rank or dignity? The records fall silent, but human nature does not. We suspect they went somewhere, did something, and we search for the signs they might have left behind. Those signs, if they exist, do not come in the form of treasure or scrolls hidden in oak groves. They come in something quieter, consistency. There are institutions that emerged in the centuries after the Templars fell, institutions that seemed to operate with a moral compass that felt familiar, naval orders that prized internal codes over external fame, brotherhoods that bound members through ordeal and oath, not money or lineage. Even international relief organizations that functioned with striking coordination long before modern communication seemed to reflect a mindset that once moved knights across continents. But beyond the institutions, there is something even more telling: the reappearance of the Templar archetype, the silent protector, the disciplined builder, the man or woman who holds a line no one sees and asks for nothing in return. These figures are not always famous, they rarely are, but they shape the world in quiet increments, guarding not relics, but values. And when we encounter them, we feel something ancient stir. Not because they look like knights, but because they act like them. This is how legacy works when it has shed its skin. The outer forms are gone, but the inner engine still turns. In a digital age where everything demands visibility, the Templar method remains quietly revolutionary. It resists the need to be seen. It rejects the pull of ego. It reminds us that there are other ways to live, ways that prioritize structure over spectacle and clarity over clamor. And in doing so, it exposes how little we've changed. We still fear chaos, still crave order, still look, when things fall apart, for someone who seems to remember how to hold the center. Perhaps that's why we can't let go of the Templars, not because of what they hid, but because of what they embodied. And somewhere out there, perhaps a few still walk among us, not as relics, not as conspirators, but as quiet reminders of what discipline, purpose, and silence can still achieve. The notion that the Templars vanished entirely is a convenient fiction, tidy, dramatic, and easy to teach. But history, when looked at closely, rarely offers such clean endings. In truth, organizations with as much reach, discipline, and internal cohesion as the Templars do not simply evaporate. They adapt. They change form. Some flee, some fragment, some hide in plain sight. What was once a knightly order sanctioned by Pope and King may have fractured, yes, but its pieces scattered like seeds, and seeds, if planted in the right soil, have a habit of growing again, just not in the shape we might expect. It is tempting to hunt for the grand gestures, the ceremonial continuities. But the real survival of the Templar ethos lies in the small things, in the way certain legal codes were structured to protect the powerless, in the design of secure communication systems used centuries before the telegraph, in the unwritten norms of service professions that demand discretion, reliability, and moral clarity. These echoes are not ornamental, they are functional, and they are still very much alive. What gives them away is not appearance, but behavior. Those who carry the Templar rhythm are rarely flamboyant. They do not seek headlines. Their influence is the sort you only notice in hindsight. They are the people who bring order to disorder, who keep institutions standing when everyone else is shouting or fleeing. They are calm in the storm not because they are fearless, but because they are trained. And that training, passed through time not by decree, but by example, has found its way into the fabric of modern professions, in intelligence, in logistics, in diplomacy, and in specialized units of military and humanitarian response. But not everyone who walks that path knows the origin of the road beneath them. That's the strange beauty of the Templar legacy. It was designed to be absorbed, to be naturalized. It does not need to be named to survive. And perhaps that is the truest form of endurance, not to be remembered as a statue or slogan, but to live on as a method, invisible but essential. So, when people ask if the Knights Templar still exist, they're usually looking in the wrong place. They scan for regalia, for cryptic symbols, for arcane gatherings in candlelit halls. But the real answer lies elsewhere, in the flow of systems that still echo their design, in the choices made by those who still embody their discipline, and in the quiet work of people who build, protect, and serve without fanfare. The order is no longer a visible body, but its heart still beats, in methods, in values, in silence. By now, it becomes clear that the legacy of the Templars is less a trail of clues than it is a shift in how we recognize continuity. We are not looking for an organization with annual meetings and a central archive, but for a philosophy that learned how to travel without being seen. If the Templars survived, they did so by evolving from institution to instinct. The trappings of rank and ceremony may have disappeared, but the impulse towards structure, service, and secrecy did not. Those habits, once forged in the crucible of crusade and sacrifice, proved far too useful to be discarded. What we begin to see instead is a pattern of quiet convergence. Individuals, unconnected by blood or flag, drawn to similar disciplines. They appear in moments of crisis, not as saviors, but as stabilizers. You'll find them in roles that require calm under pressure, the ability to keep a confidence, or the willingness to act in defense of others without asking for recognition. These are not accidents. They are modern expressions of the same psychological architecture that once shaped the order, and that architecture remains remarkably relevant. In an era where everything is fluid, where institutions are questioned and information moves faster than truth can catch up, the Templar rhythm seems almost countercultural. It is slow, deliberate, methodical. It prizes silence over spectacle, longevity over attention. And that makes it not obsolete, but revolutionary. In a world constantly pulling us outward, the Templar impulse draws inward, toward clarity, toward control, toward an internal compass unshaken by the storm outside. Of course, this rhythm is not easy to find. It rarely announces itself, but you can feel it in places where order is maintained without showmanship, where integrity is practiced, not preached, where networks exist not to amplify the self, but to strengthen the whole. In these places, the echo of the temple is alive and well, not as nostalgia, not as fantasy, but as a living model for how to move through the world with purpose. And so we begin to understand the Templars are not a lost order to be found, but a method still waiting to be recognized. They are not hiding in some distant vault. They are present in the way certain people build, serve, and protect. No ceremonies needed, no secret handshakes, just a quiet fidelity to an ancient rhythm. A rhythm that, even after all this time, continues to move beneath the surface. There are moments when history doesn't feel like something we read about. It feels like something breathing, just beneath the skin of the present. You sense it when you walk into certain buildings, or hear certain words spoken with weight that's hard to explain. It's not superstition. It's not myth. It's recognition. We feel it when we encounter something built to last, something shaped not by trend or ego, but by quiet, careful intent. The legacy of the Knights Templar lives in that space, not in marble statues or dusty scrolls, but in the discipline of things made to endure, in systems that function even when no one is watching, in trust that travels silently between people who've never met but somehow understand the same rules. In many ways, the Templar spirit persists because it was never entirely about religion or warfare. It was about form, about method, about how to bind men to each other and to something larger than themselves through vow, habit, and action. The outward trappings, the white mantles, the red crosses, the mounted charges were only ever surface. Beneath that was something leaner, harder, and more durable. A way of thinking that knew how to survive fire, exile, suppression, and time. That thinking did not fade when the order was disbanded. It seeped into other things quietly, into banking systems, into early courier networks, into political councils and fraternal orders. But more importantly, it seeped into people. People who understood that structure without ego could be a kind of salvation, that working in silence was not a punishment, but a kind of honor, that building something without attaching your name to it was not a sacrifice, but a statement of belief. And belief, when tempered by rigor, is a form of power almost no force can touch. Even today, when the world moves faster than thought and most traditions are discarded before they can be tested, that kind of thinking still finds its place. You see it in people who work behind the scenes to hold things together, in those who don't ask to be seen, but whose absence would cause everything to fall apart, in structures that hum with unseen order, in that rare person who knows how to lead without shouting and how to serve without bending. That's where the Templars live now, not in shadows, but in function. So no, you will not find them gathered in catacombs by torchlight, plotting beneath cathedrals. You will find them in motion, in balance, in choices made when no one is watching. And in that, they are perhaps more present now than they ever were under the eyes of kings and popes. As we move toward the end of this journey, the question begins to evolve. It is no longer just, are the Knights Templar still here? But, would we even recognize them if they were? Our search began with the assumption that survival must be visible, that legacy must take form through names, rituals, or declarations. But the Templars were never about visibility. They were always about function beneath the surface, purpose without spectacle. If they endure, they do so not in the form of cloaked assemblies or ancient parchment, but in something harder to trace and far more powerful, influence without ownership. And that influence shows up in the most unexpected places. In the internal policies of an aid organization that operates with military precision but no hierarchy. In a banking system's design that still favors secrecy and integrity over leverage. In the silent mentorships that pass knowledge from one generation to another without ceremony, just consistency. These are not inventions of the modern world. They are echoes of older blueprints, ones shaped in candlelit scriptoria and battle-planned treasuries, where trust was codified in oaths rather than contracts. Part of what keeps the Templar rhythm alive is that it offers something the world rarely gives anymore: permanence, not in buildings, but in behavior. It's no coincidence that we find ourselves repeatedly drawn back to them, in books, in films, in speculation. We are not chasing a lost order. We are reaching toward a lost ideal. The idea that there is power in restraint, value in silence, and strength in service. In a world that burns itself out on immediacy, the Templar model offers an antidote: longevity through quiet alignment. There is, of course, no certainty in any of this. That is the point. The Templars were masters of concealment, not because they wished to hide, but because they understood that some truths must be lived, not explained. They were never meant to be an open book. They were meant to be a pattern you see only when you stop looking directly and start watching how people move, how they choose, how they endure. That is where their legacy resides now, in decision-making, in stewardship, in the act of building something meant to outlast yourself. So if you're still wondering whether they are gone or just sleeping, perhaps the better answer is this: they're not a secret waiting to be found. They're a standard waiting to be upheld. And every time someone chooses to serve with discipline, to lead without pride, or to build in silence, they return. What makes the Templars so enduring in the collective imagination is not just their mystery, but the unsettling possibility that they never truly needed to return, because they never really left. The world forgets uniforms and titles quickly, but it does not forget systems that work, or principles that stabilize, or codes that survive pressure. The deeper we travel into this idea, the clearer it becomes that the Templar legacy was never just about continuity of an order, it was about continuity of function. They didn't just build castles and churches, they built a way of operating in the world that continues to surface wherever discipline meets service. It is easy to romanticize the idea of a secret group operating behind world events, but reality is far less cinematic and far more insidious. The truth is, you do not need cloaked assemblies or secret vaults to hold influence. All you need is a set of rules that can move from person to person, generation to generation, without being diluted. The Templars excelled at this. Their system taught men how to live with purpose, how to manage resources, how to navigate both the spiritual and political world with composure. These weren't just medieval virtues, they were modular habits. Habits that could survive a purge, habits that could migrate into families, guilds, monasteries, and eventually into professions that shape the world. You can see these echoes in the most unexpected corners, in the silent efficiency of disaster response teams, in the unspoken loyalty of elite units across nations, in the rigor of institutions that hold their members to a higher ethical code without ever advertising it. No one names these things as Templar, but the pattern is unmistakable to those who study long enough. The rhythm is familiar. The quiet is deliberate. The strength is not in numbers, but in structure. And this is perhaps the greatest sleight of hand the Templars ever performed. They allowed themselves to vanish in appearance while continuing to survive in behavior. Their defeat was public, symbolic, theatrical. Their persistence has been quiet, structural, methodical. In a sense, the show ended, but the architecture remained, and the people who understood its value kept building, brick by brick, in silence. So when you hear someone speak of the Templars as a lost relic of medieval zealotry, remember, the most dangerous legacies are the ones that no longer need names, the ones that adapt, invisibly, and the ones that shape the world without needing to claim it. The story of the Templars is often told through the lens of dramatic conflict, crusades, persecutions, trials, and burnings. But beneath these vivid events lies a more subtle tale, one of systems and shadows. The order at its core was not just a military force or a religious brotherhood, it was a model for organized resilience. Its members knew that true strength wasn't in momentary victory, but in long-term survival. They understood that power must be rooted not only in arms and alliances, but also in discipline, secrecy, and the ability to adapt. And those lessons remain relevant, perhaps more so now than ever. In a world increasingly dominated by instant communication and public spectacle, the Templars' legacy challenges us to reconsider the value of silence and discretion. Their survival was never meant to be heralded. It was designed to be seamless. This is why, after their official suppression, the order did not vanish. It transformed. Its principles migrated into other domains: finance, governance, intelligence, philanthropy. These fields operate best not under glaring spotlights, but in the quiet coordination of many moving parts. The Templars excelled at this delicate dance, and so their spirit lingers not in visible relics, but in enduring processes. This understanding changes how we look for the Templars today. Instead of searching for robes or secret ceremonies, we might do better to look for methods, ways organizations maintain integrity under pressure, for individuals who uphold principles without public acclaim, for systems that function smoothly when unobserved. These are the living legacies. They do not declare themselves but invite recognition to those attuned to their rhythm. Moreover, the Templars' approach to knowledge, its collection, protection, and transmission, anticipates modern concerns about data security, decentralized control, and trust networks. Their encrypted ledgers and coded communications foreshadow the information age's challenges and solutions. The continuity of these ideas across centuries suggests that the Templar ethos is less a relic and more a prototype for sustainable organization. Recognizing this prototype helps us understand not only their past, but also how certain structures endure today. In the end, the question is not only about whether the Knights Templar still exist, but whether their principles still guide us. If discipline, loyalty, and strategic discretion remain essential in a chaotic world, then their legacy is far from extinct. It lives on quietly, embedded in the very ways we organize, protect, and serve. In tracing the echoes of the Knights Templar, one encounters a paradox. Their dramatic downfall is well documented, yet their influence seems to have expanded in unexpected directions after their official dissolution. This suggests that the Order's greatest strength lay not in its numbers or wealth, but in the resilience of its systems. Unlike many groups that collapse under pressure, the Templars built a network designed to outlast adversity. They understood that survival required more than loyalty to a cause. It demanded an adaptable structure that could thrive even in obscurity. This adaptability became their secret weapon. By embedding their methods into the social, economic, and religious fabric of medieval Europe, the Templars ensured that their influence would persist long after their name was outlawed. Their innovations in finance, such as early banking systems and letters of credit, became foundational for European economies. Their model for managing vast estates and properties influenced land law and administration. These practical contributions formed a quiet legacy that history books often overlook, but that shaped the modern world. Moreover, the Order's commitment to discipline and secrecy laid the groundwork for future organizations that operate on similar principles. Many modern institutions that require tight security, hierarchical trust, and strategic discretion bear the imprint of the Templar design. This includes intelligence agencies, secret societies, and even decentralized technological networks that rely on cryptographic principles reminiscent of medieval ciphers. Though these groups may not acknowledge a direct lineage, the parallels in structure and purpose are striking. The Templars' story also highlights the power of symbols and ritual in maintaining cohesion. Their use of coded language, ceremonies, and signs created a shared identity that transcended geography and politics. These elements allowed members to trust one another implicitly and act cohesively in fragmented political landscapes. This legacy of symbolic communication continues in many organizations today, where ritual and tradition sustain group unity and purpose without overt control. Understanding the Knights Templar as a structural and cultural phenomenon, rather than just a historical curiosity, invites us to reconsider the nature of legacy itself. Their survival was not about surviving as a named order, but surviving as a way of being, a set of principles and practices that could be adopted and adapted across centuries and continents. Their disappearance from the record is not a story of erasure, but of transformation. Reflecting on the long arc of the Knights Templars' history, one sees a story less about abrupt endings and more about quiet persistence. The Order's dramatic collapse was undeniable, marked by trials and executions that sought to erase its presence. Yet beneath this turmoil, a different narrative unfolded, one of endurance through adaptation. Their methods and mindset, deeply ingrained in their members, did not simply vanish with the last public execution. Instead, they dispersed, embedded within new contexts, waiting for the right moment to resurface in new forms. The Templars' emphasis on merit, loyalty, and disciplined action created a blueprint that could be replicated without the trappings of title or ceremony. This allowed their principles to migrate into other organizations and movements that valued similar virtues. From secretive religious groups to emerging financial institutions, elements of the Templar ethos survived in the way power was structured and exercised. This was not mere coincidence, but the result of a system designed to transcend the constraints of its time. Moreover, the Order's mastery of coded communication, encrypted records, and networked operations foreshadowed many aspects of modern organizational management. Their understanding of how to maintain cohesion across dispersed and autonomous units anticipates challenges faced by today's complex global institutions. In this way, the Templars serve as early pioneers of organizational resilience, demonstrating how discipline and discretion can form the backbone of enduring systems. This legacy challenges our assumptions about disappearance and survival. True endurance is not about remaining visible or celebrated. It is about the ability to adapt, integrate, and influence beneath the surface. The Templars' disappearance from the public eye was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a transformation. Their spirit continues in patterns of trust, structures of secrecy, and modes of disciplined service that remain vital in a chaotic world. So as we ask whether the Knights Templar are still here, we might better ask whether their way of being continues to shape how people organize, protect, and persevere. If it does, then their presence remains as real as ever, hidden in plain sight, enduring beyond legend. As we conclude this journey through the shadows and echoes of the Knights Templar, one truth becomes clear. Their legacy is not a relic locked away in forgotten vaults, but a living rhythm that still pulses beneath the surface of modern life. They were never merely knights in white cloaks. They were architects of a system, a way of acting, organizing, and enduring that transcended their time. Their dissolution was brutal and public, but their influence receded quietly, woven into the fabric of institutions, disciplines, and values that continue to shape our world. The Templar's story reminds us that power is not always wielded through spectacle or force. Sometimes it survives through silence, discipline, and structure. Their model teaches that true strength comes from resilience, trust, and a commitment to purpose beyond personal glory. These are lessons as vital today as they were 8 centuries ago. In a world overwhelmed by noise and fleeting attention, the Templar ethos calls us back to clarity, to endurance, and to service without fanfare. Perhaps the greatest secret of the Knights Templar is that their presence does not depend on names or symbols, but on choices made daily by those who act with integrity, who build without seeking praise, and who protect truths that cannot be burned away. Their legacy lives not as a conspiracy, but as a call to live with conviction when the world demands silence. And in that call, they remain with us still. If you have found this exploration meaningful, please consider liking and subscribing for more journeys into history's hidden paths. I invite you to share where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always inspiring to see the quiet constellation of listeners across the globe. Thank you for joining this journey, and may the silent path guide you well.